Chapter 158. Go to watch net. Looking at Li Yundong and Su Chan's affectionate appearance, for a moment, Wan Hongling and Zi Yuan sighed inwardly. Go to watch net. Regardless of whether they have violated the taboo between them, at least the feelings between them are deep. Zi Yuan sighed slightly in her heart. Zhou Qin was in a daze. She suddenly found that the boy in front of her and the girl in front of her were so strange. She thought that she had gotten closer to Li Yundong and understood this boy more and more, but in the end, she found that she knew nothing about this boy. In the past, Guan Yunchang, the sage of martial arts, killed the bully in a rage when he saw the bully bullying the villagers. In the end, he went into exile and even changed his name. I didn't expect that this boy, who looks easygoing and likes to joke, is such a character. But at that time, it was the three kingdoms in chaos, and human life was as cheap as grass. But now it is a peaceful time, and there is actually such a character like Emperor Guan. Zhou Qin was shocked by Li Yundong's actions, and her heart was filled with an indescribable feeling. She stared at Li Yundong and Su Chan, watching the two of them hugging each other tightly, as if they would not be separated even if the sea ran dry and the rocks crumbled. Zhou Qin's heart was squeezed fiercely. She suddenly realized that it was impossible for her to get between these two people in her life, because they loved each other so much that they were even willing to give up their lives for each other. What in the world could separate such a pair of lovers who loved each other so much? At this moment, Zhou Qin's heart was as cold as ash. Li Yundong and Su Chan hugged each other tightly. He only had eyes for her, and she only had eyes for him. What the people around them were watching and talking had nothing to do with them. Whether it was divine punishment or anything else, they had all been thrown to the back of their minds. At this moment, they knew that the other party loved them. Although they didn't say it out loud, their infatuated eyes had already explained everything. Zi Yuan seemed to be unable to bear to see the pair of lovers being separated like this. She couldn't help saying, in fact, you have a way to avoid divine punishment. Go to watch net. When Li Yundong and Su Chan heard this, they immediately felt as if they had heard the sound of nature. At the same time, they asked happily, what is it? Zi Yuan looked at him fixedly and said slowly, I will never reach the Zhuji phase. Ah. Li Yundong and Su Chan were shocked at the same time. Why? Because cultivation pursues immortality and transcends the shackles of birth, aging, illness, and death. Birth, aging, illness, and death are the natural laws of all things in the world. Anyone who violates this law will be punished by heaven. Therefore, cultivation is the most heaven-defying thing in the world. When the accumulated energy of a cultivator reaches a certain level, it will naturally attract the heavenly thunder. This principle is the same as the taller a building is, the easier it is to be struck by lightning. Li Yundong suddenly understood and said, if I don't cultivate and don't build the foundation, I will never attract heavenly thunder. Zi Yuan's eyes flashed with admiration. She nodded and said, that's exactly what I mean. If you don't build your foundation, the heavenly lightning won't be able to find your aura and naturally won't strike you. But once you build your foundation, it will be equivalent to building a tall building on flat ground. The heavenly lightning will naturally have a target. Li Yundong asked in confusion, doesn't that mean that there are cultivators who are proficient in qi cultivating who use talismans to kill people without building their foundation? That way, they can endlessly avoid divine punishment? Zi Yuan said lightly, there are loopholes in any commandment or rule, let alone such a vast world. If the world is really strict and there are no loopholes, how can we cultivators become immortals? As she spoke, Zi Yuan glanced at Li Yundong and said meaningfully, however, once you set foot on the road of cultivation, it will be difficult for you to resist the desire and impulse to build your foundation. You have to understand that before and after the Zhuji phase are completely different. Before the Zhuji phase, you are just an ordinary person who is a little stronger than a mortal. But once you succeed in building your foundation, you will be a future immortal. You can go to heaven and earth, transcend the mortal world and become a saint. Li Yundong was fascinated by what Zi Yuan had said. He couldn't help but think of what Su Chan had said to him before, when you succeed in cultivation, we will travel the world together and have fun. How wonderful such a life would be. Su Chan held Li Yundong's arm worriedly, for fear that he would make up his mind to build his foundation and seek his own death. She begged in a sad voice, Yundong, it's okay if we don't build our foundation. We can hide in a place where no one can find us and live happily together. Let's go to the internet. 7 K.O. Hong O.M. Li Yundong suddenly smiled and said, then I'll be a virgin for the rest of my life, and you'll also be a virgin for the rest of your life? Su Chan couldn't help blushing, and the bitterness in her heart dissipated a lot because of Li Yundong's teasing. She said angrily, you're so annoying. What nonsense are you talking about? Her angry and happy appearance only moved the heart of a peerless beauty like Zi Yuan. She couldn't help but sigh, what a pitiful little fairy. No wonder Li Yundong is so obsessed with her. Zi Yuan pitied the true feelings of the two of them and couldn't help but say, as long as you don't build your foundation, at least you can live your next life in peace. But don't think about cultivation for the rest of your life. Su Chan's heart tightened. She took Li Yundong's arm and tried to persuade him again, Yundong, let's not build our foundation, okay? I'm so afraid that after you succeed, you will. Before she could finish her words, she suddenly heard a cold snort. The people of the Jingyi school really only know how to come up with bad ideas. After so many years, you still haven't made any progress. Everyone was stunned and looked towards the direction of the voice, only to see a 3-feet-long green peak sword flying across the sky with a swoosh in the distance, emitting a faint white light. On the sword stood a graceful and elegant woman with long hair that reached her waist and a skirt that fluttered in the wind. As soon as Zi Yuan saw the woman, her body suddenly trembled and she couldn't help whispering, the 3-feet-long sword is cold, and the hair is green. She is a romantic, and her heart has been haunted for several lives. Ruan Hongling widened her eyes and looked at the cold woman in front of her. She cried out involuntarily, sword immortal? As she spoke, she turned her head and asked Zi Yuan in confusion, Sister Zi Yuan, what are you talking about? Zi Yuan's eyes were fixed on the woman, and her eyes suddenly became extremely distant and sad. Do you still remember a line of poetry that Master once carved with a sword on the wind dust stone? Ruan Hongling's eyes widened and she stammered, you mean? Zi Yuan's eyes fell on the long sword under the woman's feet. She sighed faintly and said, don't you think this sword is very familiar? Ruan Hongling stared at the sword for a while with her eyes wide open. Suddenly, she shouted in surprise, this is Ba Huang. This is Master's sword. How could it be in her hand? Is she? Zi Yuan and Ruan Hongling stared at the woman. For a moment it was as if they had seen an incredible person. They were so shocked that they couldn't speak. However, the woman didn't look at them. She just glanced at them, as if she didn't take them seriously at all. Instead, she just looked at Li Yundong seriously and then looked at Su Chan sternly. Su Chan also stared at her with her eyes wide open. Her face was full of surprise, joy, and fear. She cried out involuntarily, Master? Almost at the same time, Ruan Hongling also cried out involuntarily. You are the seven-tailed fox spirit of the Fox Zen school, O Wushuang. You're not dead? Li Yundong was stunned. Ao Wushuang? Why was the name so cocky? However, she is the little girl's master, and the little girl is so powerful. She must be very arrogant, right? Li Yundong looked at the woman who had flown over on the sword seriously. He saw that the woman was extremely beautiful, even more so than Su Chan. She had a perfect oval face, small and enchanting. Her lips were like vermilion, and her skin was white as snow. The corners of her eyes were slightly raised, making her look proud and indifferent. However, there was a vermilion beauty mole between her eyebrows, which made her incomparably cold and elegant face lively, bright, and charming. Li Yundong had seen the bright and lovely Su Chan, the dignified and generous Zhou Qin, the coquettish and sexy Chao Kefi, and the otherworldly beauty of Zi Yuan. When he saw Ao Wushuang again, he felt that the visual impact of this woman was the strongest. She clearly had a cold and arrogant face, but when ordinary people saw her, they felt that she was romantic and charming. Her eyes were obviously cold and vicissitudes of life, but they made people feel that she would smile sweetly at any time and steal their souls. "Is this your master?" Li Yundong couldn't help turning to look at Su Chan. Su Chan hid behind Li Yundong with some fear and nodded slightly. "Yes, this is my master. She must have come to find me." When Ao Wushuang heard her words, she sneered and said, "Do you still remember me as your master? Look at how much trouble you've caused in the mortal world." Li Yundong couldn't bear to hear others scolding his girl, even if this person was Su Chan's master. He blocked Su Chan with his body and said loudly, "She is very obedient and didn't cause any trouble. I caused the trouble here." Ao Wushuang looked Li Yundong up and down, snorted coldly, and her eyes were full of disdain. "What's the difference between what you did and what she did?" Li Yundong said loudly, "I will bear the consequences of my own actions. Of course, I will bear the consequences myself. It has nothing to do with Su Chan. Don't always involve her." Su Chan hid behind Li Yundong timidly. She was moved and sad at the same time. She couldn't help poking her head out and saying loudly, "No, this is the trouble I caused. Master, please punish me." The way the two of them were trying to exonerate each other made Ao Wushuang's eyes flash with a sad look, but she quickly regained her indifference. "Can you two solve the problem by pushing it back and forth like this?" Su Chan was stunned and couldn't help but have an idea. She shouted with joy, "Master, you have a way to help Li Yundong get through the heavenly tribulation, right? You must have a way, right?" Su Chan thought of her master's extraordinary ability. She was so powerful that she must have a way to help Li Yundong resolve the heavenly tribulation. The more she thought about it, the more excited she became. She couldn't help jumping out of Li Yundong's side and quickly running to Ao Wushuang's side. She pulled her sleeve and said sadly, "Master, you must have a way. Please help Yundong. You can punish me in any way you want." Ao Wushuang was silent for a long time before she snorted coldly. "Are you so sure that I have a way?" Su Chan said anxiously, "Master, your magic is so powerful. There must be a way, right? /om/" Chapter 159. Go to watch net. Ao Wushuang looked at the anxious Su Chan and sighed slightly in her heart, but her face was still as cold as frost. She snorted and said, "Do you really think I'm an immortal? Do you really believe me when I say I have a way? You've been in the mortal world for so many days, how can you still be so childish?" As she said this, she pointed at Li Yundong and said coldly, "If this person had bad intentions and spoke sweet words to you, would you be fooled?" Su Chan was shocked. "No, Yundong is not such a person. He treats me very well. He. Su Chan saw that the look in her master's eyes was getting more and more strange, and her heart suddenly thumped. She unconsciously stepped back, wanting to run back to Li Yundong's side. Watch net. 7 KOM. However, when Ao Wushuang pointed her finger at Su Chan, she froze on the spot. Her body felt as if it weighed thousands of kilograms, and she couldn't move at all. Ao Wushuang sneered and said, "You want to go back to him? Come with me obediently." Li Yundong was shocked. "What are you doing? Let her go." When Ao Wushuang saw him rushing over, she pointed at him with her finger. Suddenly, Li Yundong felt as if he had been handcuffed by an extremely heavy chain. Even though he had amazing divine strength, he was like traveling monk's son being pressed under the 5 elements mountain, unable to move at all. What's going on? Li Yundong couldn't imagine that such a peerless beauty would be able to stop him with just a light touch from such a proud and arrogant woman. Don't make things difficult for her. If you have something to say, come at me. Li Yundong roared. You? Ao Wushuang sneered. What can you do? After that, Ao Wushuang suddenly pinched her fingers and shouted, 8 Desolations. With that, the 8 Desolation celestial sword under her feet suddenly disappeared and then reappeared in front of her in an instant. The body of the sword made a buzzing sound. Ao Wuxuang pointed at Li Yunyang and shouted, "Can you stop it?" As soon as her voice fell, the Bahuang sword made a clanging sound and instantly turned into countless 3 feet long green peak swords, like a lotus blooming in an instant. The layers of petals were blades that rotated rapidly. They were incomparably sharp, and the friction made a sizzling sound. The iron lotus rushed towards Li Yundong like a bolt of lightning. Su Chan was scared out of her wits. "No," she screamed. Li Yundong only felt his vision go black, and the iron lotus instantly rushed over. But when it rushed in front of him, it stopped in an instant, like countless whirlpools of blades that were constantly rotating, shrouding his eyes and making a terrible sound of metal friction. Li Yundong had no doubt that if this iron lotus with a diameter of 2 to 3 meters pounced on him, he would immediately be turned into countless pieces of flesh and blood. Li Yundong was shocked. He had never seen such magic and means. Just when Li Yunyang thought that Ao Wuxuang was going to kill him, there was suddenly nothing in front of him. The steel lotus composed of countless Bahuang swords was like a blooming flower closing into a flower bud. The sword edges closed one by one, and then quickly turned into a 3-foot-long green sword. "Watch net." The green sword paused in front of Li Yundong for a moment, allowing him to clearly see the 2 antique seal scripts engraved on it, Bahuang. Then the Bahuang sword disappeared in an instant and returned to Ao Wuxuang's feet in an instant. Ao Wuxuang said proudly, "What do you think?" Li Yundong sneered and said loudly without changing his expression, "Do you think you can scare me like this? If you have the ability, kill me. Otherwise, even if I die, I will die with Su Chan." Ao Wuxuang suddenly became furious. She raised her hand, and countless green vines suddenly grew out of Li Yundong's feet, entangling him tightly. At first, these green vines were only as thick as a little finger. They grew from Li Yundong's feet and climbed all the way up his calves. Soon, when they climbed to his thighs, they became as thick as a thumb. When they climbed to his waist, they had grown as thick as a forearm. When they reached his chest, they were as thick as a thigh. Ruan Hongling and Zi Yuan watched in shock as the green vine grew wildly into the sky. In an instant, it entangled Li Yundong. They knew that as long as Ao Wuxuang thought about it, Li Yundong would be strangled to death. But soon, Ao Wuxuang pointed at the green vine again. In an instant, a flame ignited on the tip of her finger, and then the green vine began to burn. Li Yundong, who was bound by the vines, felt that he was suffocated by the tight vines. Just as he was about to shout, he suddenly felt a burning pain coming from all around him. "Is this woman going to burn me to death?" Li Yundong was shocked. This is not a good way to die. But just as he was about to be burned to death, the green vines around him suddenly burst open, and the flames attached to the green vines splashed everywhere. Go to CNET. 7 KOM. Colorful * rainbow * literature _ learning % super #speed. Before Li Yundong could take a breath, he suddenly felt that the sky had suddenly darkened. He looked up subconsciously and saw a huge rock coming at him. In the blink of an eye, it was over his head. Just as a trace of fear flashed in Li Yundong's eyes, the huge rock suddenly stopped an inch above his head with a loud bang. Li Yundong fixed his eyes and saw that there was a stream of water that was as thick as a finger flowing above his head. It was like a shield, forcibly carrying the huge rock falling from the sky. With a wave of Ao Wuxuang's hand, the water shield shook violently and threw the huge rock away. With a muffled thud, it hit the ground, creating a deep pit. Ruan Hongling and Zi Yuan were stunned. Ruan Hongling said, "She's actually proficient in the 5 elements of magic at the same time? Isn't this too exaggerated?" Zi Yuan was also secretly shocked. This series of attacks is as fast as lightning. After making a move, she immediately takes it back. Her methods are so fast that it's really too much for the eyes to take in. Even I can't resist it. Ao Wushuang is indeed worthy of being the top master of the Fox Zen school. Li Yundong seemed to have been stunned by the series of attacks just now. He stood there in a daze, unable to come to his senses for a while. Ao Wushuang shouted angrily, "I have more than 100 kinds of shintong that can kill you in an instant. Just now, I only showed you 5 of them. Even a cultivator like me has to fear the heavenly tribulation and don't dare to get into trouble. You're just an uncultured brat. How dare you drag my beloved disciple into this mess with you?" As she spoke, Ao Wushuang seemed to recall something from the past. A look of extreme pain flashed in her eyes. She scolded loudly, "Don't think that you're great just because you're the successor of Jin Dan. You haven't even stepped into the threshold of cultivation. You're still very young. If you don't have the ability, don't try to be a hero. And don't get me, my disciple, into trouble." Ao Wushuang's series of attacks had made Li Yundong unable to fight back at all. This kind of shame and humiliation made him unable to react for a while, but then Ao Wushuang's scolding suddenly made his heart tremble. Su Chan had already burst into tears. Su Chan had already burst into tears. She struggled frantically and cried, "Master, don't take me away. I want to be with Yundong." Ao Wushuang scolded loudly, "Shut up. What good will it be for you to be with him? When the divine punishment comes, you will also be struck to death. Do you know that?" Su Chan cried, "If I die, I die. I'm willing to die with Yundong." Ao Wushuang was so angry that she scolded, "You're really crazy and obsessed." Li Yundong raised his head and let out a long sigh. He advised Su Chan, "Su Chan, listen to your master and go by yourself." Ao Wushuang snorted coldly and said, "At least you've said something reasonable." Then she pulled Su Chan's arm and was about to leave. Su Chan staggered because of Ao Wushuang's pull. She cried and looked back at Li Yundong with tears in her eyes. Zi Yuan, who was standing to one side, suddenly said, "Senior Wushuang." Ao Wushuang glanced at her coldly and said, "What? Do you want to meddle in the family affairs of our Fox Zen school?" Zi Yuan cupped her hands and said, "I don't dare. I just want to ask, this Bahuang sword is the most precious treasure of our Zhuni school's Linggong sect. When will you return it to our sect? In addition, our second Sherbua visited your sect 9 years ago, but there has been no news of her whereabouts. I wonder if Senior knows anything about it." Ao Wushuang laughed and said, "Are you talking about your master's shimmy? How would I know her whereabouts? In addition, this Bahuang sword, hee, little girl, if you have the ability, come and take it yourself." As she said this, she pulled Su Chan and turned into a beam of green light in the blink of an eye. Ruan Hongling watched her leave and stamped her feet angrily. This witch is really domineering. Zi Yuan shook her head and looked at Li Yundong. She saw that the boy seemed to have lost his soul. He stood there in a daze, motionless like a stone statue. Although Ruan Hongling had had friction with Li Yundong before, she still couldn't bear to see him like this. She felt sour in her heart. She nudged Zi Yuan with her elbow and whispered, "Sister Zi Yuan, he." Zi Yuan shook her head and said, "Everything is predestined." As she spoke, she suddenly thought of something and quickly said to Ruan Hongling, "There must have been a lot of secular mortals who saw this scene just now. Hurry up and deal with it." Ruan Hongling was also shocked. She looked around and saw that the people who had been pointing at them had fallen to the ground. She quickly rushed over and saw that these people had all fainted on the ground. There was a big tree lying across the road 2 or 3 miles away, blocking the traffic. Only then did Ruan Hongling feel convinced. Ao Wushuang's magical power is amazing, but it's really rare to see such a meticulous mind. Ao Wushuang took Su Chan and flew more than 10 miles away. She saw that Su Chan, who was beside her, had been silent, instead of crying like before. She was surprised and turned her head to take a look. She was shocked and slapped Su Chan on the back, scolding, "You're crazy. How dare you destroy your own meridians? Su Chan spat out a mouthful of blood. She wanted to commit suicide but failed, so she burst into tears and said, "If you want to take me away, I'd rather die." Ao Wushuang said angrily, "What's so good about that man? Why are you so infatuated with him?" Su Chan said with tears streaming down her face, "Yundong is the person who treats me the best in the world." As she spoke, she told him everything that had happened between her and Li Yundong. Even the trivial things like her playing behind his back and Li Yundong buying her an ice cream were all clearly told. The more she spoke, the more Su Chan cried. After that, she cried loudly and said, "After I left him last time, I felt that although the world was big, there was no place for me to go. Although there were many people in the world, there was no one worthy of my love. When I was by his side, I felt happy. Even if I drank a glass of cold water, it would feel sweet and warm. When I wasn't by his side, I felt that the sky was going to collapse and the earth was going to sink. There was no longer any joy in this world." Ao Wushuang was stunned when she heard this. She seemed to remember her own sad things and couldn't help but cry slowly. She hugged Su Chan and sighed in a trembling voice. "Silly girl, didn't I tell you that the most bitter thing in the world is love? Your master has suffered a lot in his life. Why do you want to repeat my mistakes?" Su Chan wiped away her tears and said in a sad voice, "Love is bitter, but if you taste the sweetness in it, you will understand that the sweetest thing in the world is love. In order to taste the sweetness in it, no matter how much pain you suffer, it is worth it." As she said this, Su Chan took Ao Wushuang's hand and begged bitterly, "Master, I beg you, let me go back to Yundong. Without him, I really can't live." Ao Wushuang let out a long sigh and stroked Su Chan's hair lovingly. "Silly girl, do you really think I want to take you away from him?" When Su Chan heard this, it seemed that there was a turning point. She was immediately surprised and happy. "Master, what do you mean, /om/?" Chapter 160. Go to Watch Network. Ao Wushuang sighed and said, "I'm not blind. How can I not see the love between you and him? But because you have such a deep relationship with him, I must take you away." Su Chan asked in surprise, "Why?" Ao Wushuang said, "You've already tried to build the Zhuji phase with him, haven't you?" Su Chan was shocked again. "Master, did you find us a long time ago?" Ao Wushuang shook her head and said, "I've been paying attention to you for a long time. I didn't want to interfere in your affairs, but when I saw you fail for the first time, I made up my mind to take you away." Su Chan said loudly, "Why?" "Master, with your help, he will definitely succeed in building the Zhuji phase." Ao Wushuang couldn't help but say angrily, "Nonsense. The Zhuji phase depends on yourself. How can you let others help you? In this way, even if you successfully refine the Naiden, it will be a fake Naiden. Once you meet a master, you will definitely be vulnerable. You and him are together all day long, and your feelings for each other are deep and true. Sex is like karma. Once a person is in love, how can he not be aroused?" Hearing this, Su Chan couldn't help blushing. She lowered her head, tugged at the corner of her clothes with her fingers, and didn't say anything. "Go to the watch net." Ao Wushuang snorted coldly and said, "He still wants to build the Zhuji phase? In his next life." Only then did Su Chan know that her master had taken her away from Li Yundong because her existence had always made Li Yundong feel aroused and unable to build the Zhuji phase. The resentment in her heart gradually disappeared. She raised her head, her face as red as an apple, and said timidly, "Then, when he succeeds in building the Zhuji phase, what should we do when the divine punishment comes?" Ao Wushuang thought for a while and said, "I'll think of a way then." Su Chan was ecstatic. She took Ao Wushuang's hand and shook it hard, saying loudly, "Master, I know that you are the person who treats me the best in the world. You must help Yundong. He is very smart and talented." He visualized the 9-9 lotus throne for the first time. Ao Wushuang smiled and said, "Why?" Isn't your lover the best person in the world? Why did I suddenly become the best person to you? Su Chan was embarrassed and said coquettishly, Master. Ao Wushuang showed a rare expression of appreciation and said, What did you just say? He was able to visualize 9 lotus platforms on his first try. The first time I saw him, I felt that his potential was extraordinary, and that he might be a rare genius that only appears once in 100 years. Who would have thought that he would be a genius that only appears once in 500 years? Su Chan couldn't help raising her head proudly, as if Ao Wushuang was praising her. She said, Yes, Yundong is the smartest. Master, you teach him. He's not as stupid as me. I'm sure he'll be able to learn once he learns. Ao Wushuang shook her head and said, I can't teach him. Su Chan said anxiously, Master, you know so many magical skills. Why can't you teach them? Ao Wushuang sighed and said, I know my own abilities. Although I'm known as the top master of the Fox Zen school, I can only do so much. What I've learned is too much, and I'm not good at it. If I teach him, it will only be a waste of his precious talent. Su Chan looked at Ao Wushuang eagerly. Then who can teach you? Ao Wushuang said, Didn't you just see it? It's so far away, but so close. Su Chan was stunned and said involuntarily, You mean? Ao Wushuang smiled, and her eyes suddenly became very distant. More than 10 years ago, my enemy told me about this. Su Chan was confused and asked in confusion, What is it? Ao Wushuang shook her head with a pained look in her eyes. Forget it, it's been a long time. Don't mention it. Go to the internet. 7 KOM. Don't worry about your lover. He has his own good fortune. As long as he can successfully build the Zhuji phase and survive the divine tribulation, his achievements will be limitless, and he will definitely far surpass me. I can also leave you to him with peace of mind. Su Chan's face was full of joy at first, but when she heard the last sentence, she couldn't help but ask anxiously, Master, you don't want me anymore? Ao Wushuang laughed and said, One moment you hate me, and the next moment you're afraid that I don't want you anymore. Chaner, you really change so fast. Su Chan lowered her head shyly, but soon she raised it again and asked weakly, Master, can I say goodbye to Yundong? If I leave like this, with his character and temper, he will definitely go to extremes. I'm afraid that he will take it too hard. Ao Wushuang stared at Su Chan and sighed deeply. What an idiot. You go, lest he holds a grudge against me. Maybe in the future. Su Chan asked, In the future what? Ao Wushuang shook her head and said, Nothing. Go ahead and come back quickly. Su Chan responded and turned into a beam of cyan light. But soon she came back and looked at Ao Wushuang eagerly. Master, can you give me the powerful magical weapon you promised me? Ao Wushuang was shocked. You really spent a lot of money for your lover. You actually want to give him the most precious treasure of our Fox Zen school? After she finished speaking, she immediately sighed and said, Forget it. Anyway, no one in our Fox Zen school can use this powerful magical weapon now. Just give it to him. As she said this, she took out a colorful brocade pouch from her side and handed it to Su Chan. She then warned, Go and come back quickly. Don't be sentimental. Don't delay his cultivation. If you do that, you will lose more than you gain. Su Chan nodded heavily and then quickly turned into a beam of cyan light and left. Go to the net. After Su Chan left, Li Yundong felt as if his chest had been hollowed out. His whole body was empty, and he had no strength at all. His 3 souls and 7 spirits were not in his body, and he was like a walking corpse. But suddenly, he saw a beam of cyan light fly back in the blink of an eye. A beautiful girl with a sweet smile stood in front of him and looked at him with a smile. Li Yundong took a closer look. Who else could it be but Su Chan? At this moment, Li Yundong felt as if he had come back to his senses. His previously empty chest was suddenly full, and his heart was so happy that it seemed to explode. He said in a trembling voice, "Girl, you're back." Su Chan had originally come to see Li Yundong with joy, but when she saw Li Yundong's appearance, she suddenly felt sad. She couldn't help crying and throwing herself into Li Yundong's arms. "Master, I missed you. Why did you come back?" Li Yundong hugged Su Chan tightly, and tears welled up in his eyes. He wiped them away and said with a smile. The two of them held hands and looked at each other with tears in their eyes, crying and laughing at the same time. Su Chan wiped away her tears and also smiled. "My master asked me to come back." Li Yundong seemed to be unable to believe his ears. He was surprised and happy. "Your master? She won't take you away?" Su Chan shook her head and told Li Yundong what Ao Wushuang had told her before. Then she looked at Li Yundong in a daze and said, "Yundong, I'm not here. You can focus on the Zhuji phase by yourself. When you succeed in the Zhuji phase and get through the Thunder Tribulation, I'll come to find you." Li Yundong couldn't help but let out a long sigh. "Your master is right. I'm still too weak. I'm so weak that I can't even protect myself." "How can I protect you?" Su Chan said loudly, "Although you are weak now, you will definitely be a first-class master in the world in the future." Li Yundong was moved and nodded hard. "Well, I will definitely work hard." The two of them looked at each other and smiled. Neither of them talked about how to get through the Heaven's Tribulation after the Zhuji phase. It was as if once they reached the Zhuji phase, the Heaven's Tribulation would not be a problem. Su Chan nestled in Li Yundong's arms and greedily sniffed his scent. After a while, she remembered something. She took out the 7 treasures brocade pouch she carried with her and patted it. In the blink of an eye, the 7 treasures brocade pouch emitted a burst of colorful light, which was so dazzling that Li Yundong subconsciously covered his eyes with his hands. But after the light disappeared, Li Yundong saw that Su Chan was holding a large black iron fan that was nearly as tall as a person. The fan was black all over and seemed to be made of iron. It was about 1.6 meters long, and each fan blade was nearly 10 centimeters long. A person with small hands would not be able to hold it with one hand. Su Chan held the big iron fan and handed it to Li Yundong. She said, "Yundong, this is for you. In the future, keep it for self-defense." Li Yundong took the big iron fan in surprise. As soon as he held it in his hands suddenly sank. He was shocked. "So heavy?" Su Chan said seriously, "This is a magical item passed down by the founder of our Fox Zen school, the Rock Fox. It's called the Fan of 7 Treasures. In the past, our founder, the Rock Ancestor, relied on this powerful magical weapon to defeat countless experts." Li Yunyang looked at the treasured fan and saw that there were countless golden Sanskrit characters engraved on the surface of the iron fan. He was shocked and suddenly remembered that the immovable Wisdom King with 3 heads and 6 arms was holding a magical item in his hand. Wasn't it this treasured fan? Seeing that Li Yundong was in a daze, Su Chan thought that he was embarrassed to accept such a powerful magical item, so she said anxiously, "You are strong, so it's convenient for you to use. There are many women in our Fox Zen school, so we can't use it. So, it's a waste for us to keep it. It's useful for you to take it." Li Yundong came to his senses, nodded, and said, "Then I won't stand on ceremony." Seeing that he had accepted it, Su Chan immediately beamed with joy. "Why are you being so polite to me?" Li Yundong also smiled and said, "Yes, my girls' things are also my things, aren't they?" Su Chan suddenly thought of something and said coquettishly, "No, my piggy bank is still mine. You can't touch it when I'm not here." Li Yundong thought of the past and couldn't help laughing. Okay, I won't touch it." "When you put the key in, did you expect that you would be away for a while? Were you afraid that I would steal your money?" Su Chan wanted to laugh when she heard this, but when she thought that she would be away from Li Yundong for a period of time, she felt sad. She pouted and couldn't help tearing up again. I don't want to be away from you for even a second. Li Yundong also forced a smile and said, it's okay. It won't be long. Maybe I'll come to see you in a few days. Su Chan wiped her tears and forced a smile. Well, when I'm not here, remember to miss me. Li Yundong held the fan of 7 treasures with one hand and held the girl's waist with the other. He kissed her gently on the lips and said, I will miss you every second. Su Chan seemed to have thought of something. She waved her hand in panic and said, no, you can't think of me when you're in the Zhuji phase. After that, she added, you can't think of me before you reach the Zhuji phase either. The girl couldn't help but say with a wronged and sad face, you can't miss me before. It's better to think about me after you finish the Zhuji phase. Li Yundong took Su Chan's hand and pressed it against his chest. He looked into her eyes and said, you are already in my heart. How can I not miss you every second? Su Chan's eyes suddenly became misty with tears. She threw herself into Li Yundong's arms again and sobbed. She held his waist with both hands and refused to let go. But at this moment, Ao Wushuang's cold voice sounded in Su Chan's mind, Su Chan, do you want to hurt him? Su Chan jumped up in fright and struggled out of Li Yundong's arms in a panic. But she only took 2 steps before she stopped in her tracks. She turned around and looked at Li Yundong. Sir, she said. I'm leaving. Li Yundong forced a smile and said, well, when you are alone, don't cook by yourself. Su Chan wanted to laugh, but she couldn't stop her tears from falling. She nodded and wiped them away. Then, she gritted her teeth and turned around to leave. But after taking 2 steps, she stopped again. She turned her head and said with tears in her eyes, Sir, I will miss you. Li Yundong also smiled with tears in his eyes and said, I will miss you too. Su Chan turned her head, wiped her tears, and walked with her head down. She took 2 steps and looked back. After walking for 20 or 30 meters, she suddenly stopped and turned around. She made a trumpet with her hands around her mouth and shouted, Yundong. You must become stronger. After shouting, she instantly turned into a green light and disappeared on the spot. Li Yundong's tears suddenly burst out of his eyes, and he choked with sobs. He stood where he was and raised his head, as if he was trying hard to hold back his tears. After looking up for a long time, Li Yundong lowered his head and also made a trumpet with his hands around his mouth. He said loudly, I will definitely become stronger. This shout spread far and wide in the wilderness of the suburbs. The sky was dignified and cold, and the earth was heavy and silent. Between heaven and earth, this shout echoed without dispersing, as if it was witnessing this young man's vow and determination. I'll say a few words about the book here. I'll have to trouble all of you to take a look at it. Perhaps someone would say, little fox is gone. When will she come back? She won't come back until the end, right? My answer is, no, she will come back soon. She will appear from time to time in the middle of the story. She is another line, and without her, the cultivation world cannot be lured out. Perhaps someone would say, the main character will start to level up and slowly leave the city. Yes, the main character will enter the cultivation world, but he will not leave the city. This is a city book first, and then the cultivation world. Don't worry, the main character will return soon. Also, some people say that the book is good, some people say that it is exciting, and some people say that it is not good. Of course, you can choose not to read it, right? Let's part on good terms. What I want to say is, this is just the beginning of the story. The real exciting part comes later. Li Yundong has just set foot on the road of cultivation. He needs to go from weak to strong. A wonderful and magnificent story has just begun, /om/. Chapter 161. Go to Watch Network. Li Yundong stood there in a daze, looking in the direction in which Su Chan had left. Although he was sad in his heart, it was much better than the pain he had felt when Su Chan had left. Besides feeling disappointed, Li Yundong's heart was filled with the will and determination to work hard to become stronger. Go to the internet. 7ko/Li Yundong stood there in a daze for a while. He walked up to Zhou Qin and sighed slightly. I'm sorry I got you involved. Zhou Qin's eyes moved. She stared at Li Yundong and sighed softly. What do you want to do next? Li Yundong thought for a moment and shook his head. I don't know. I want to turn myself in, but I can't because Su Chan is still waiting for me. Zhou Qin suddenly smiled helplessly. Don't turn yourself in. Even if you turn yourself in, you won't be convicted because there are no witnesses and no physical evidence. Even if there are traffic videos on the road that can capture you chasing after young Master He, that can't be used as evidence to convict you. I stopped you from doing it before because I was afraid that you would be involved in a murder case. If you kill him yourself, you won't be able to see the sun for the rest of your life. Even if you hide abroad, you won't stop. The forces behind young Master He won't let you go, Zhou Qin said. But if you kill him with lightning, that's another matter. As she spoke, Zhou Qin looked at the big pit where young Master He had disappeared. She said with a complicated expression, I really didn't expect that you would be able to attract lightning to kill him. Did you make up your mind from the beginning? Li Yundong shook his head. I was just thinking, he said. Since God doesn't want to use lightning to strike this man to death, then I'll use it to avenge Deng Yu, Deng Jiao, Lu, and his mother. Zhou Qin took a deep breath, as if she had made up her mind. I got it. You don't have to worry about this matter. I'll settle it. Can you do it? Li Yundong raised his head and looked at Zhou Qin worriedly. Zhou Qin smiled faintly and said, There is no such thing as no in my dictionary. Li Yundong smiled. You're always so domineering. Zi Yuan, who was standing to one side, said, The police will be here soon. Li Yundong, come with us first. Since you want to choose the path of cultivation, you must remember not to get involved in lawsuits and cases. This is a great taboo for cultivation. Li Yundong glanced at Zi Yuan, as if he couldn't understand why she was helping him like this. However, he also knew that it was definitely not a good thing for him to stay here, so he nodded and said, Can you take me away? Zi Yuan sighed in her heart. Master's words have come true. Even if I want to ignore you, it's impossible. She said softly, give me your hand. Watch net. 7kom. Li Yundong stretched out his hand in confusion. Zi Yuan stretched out a hand and gently placed it on his wrist. Her fingers were slender and white, and her wrist was as white as snow. Zi Yuan turned her head and asked Zhou Qin, Do you want to go with me? Zhou Qin shook her head. No, I'll wait here for the police to come. Someone has to deal with these things. Zi Yuan said worriedly, You should know what you can say and what you can't, right? Zhou Qin's eyes were fixed on Li Yundong. She smiled faintly and said, Do I need you to teach me this? Zi Yuan didn't care about the offense in Zhou Qin's words. She nodded slightly and said, That's good. Then, she whispered, Let's go. Li Yundong only felt his body suddenly become light, and in an instant, he flew up. He didn't even have time to close his eyes before he found that white clouds were flashing under his feet. The buildings on the vast land were as small as black dots. Li Yundong was shocked. Before he could speak, he suddenly felt his feet sink again, and he suddenly stepped on the ground. Zi Yuan said softly, We're here. Li Yundong looked around and saw that he was surrounded by pavilions and stone benches, and in the distance was a high-rise apartment. It was the Hongxing New area where he lived. Li Yundong looked at this familiar place and for a moment, he felt a little sad. He remembered that when he and the little girl had just moved in, they had met Wan Hongling here. After meeting this bitch, his life had been completely messed up. Watch net. Li Yundong stood there in a daze for a while, sighing slightly in his heart. Then, he walked home alone in silence. Ruan Hongling saw that he had turned around and left without saying a word of thanks. She was so angry that she stamped her feet. Doesn't this person know how to say thank you? Zi Yuan looked at Li Yundong's lonely back and sighed softly. Forget it. Don't hug a sad person. Besides, these things have something to do with us more or less. It's better to squash enmity than keep it alive. Ruan Hongling snorted, turned her face away, and didn't speak. After Li Yundong returned home with the big iron fan, he looked around and found that this familiar place had suddenly become so strange. It was almost evening, and the sky was slowly getting dark. Lights were on in every house, but his house was still dark. Li Yundong put the big iron fan against the door and stood in the living room for a while. Then, he pushed open Su Chan's door and stood in her room for a while. Then, he stood in each room for a short while. He closed his eyes and recalled every place and every bit of Su Chan here. It was like this could gather infinite power, allowing him to overcome the first and most important hurdle on the road of cultivation, Zhuji phase. Li Yundong walked around the room and finally stood in Su Chan's room for a long time. Then, he returned to the living room. According to what Su Chan had taught him, he opened all the windows and curtains of the balcony and living room to ensure ventilation and lighting. Then, he sat cross-legged in the living room, facing the east, ready to meditate. But as soon as he sat down and closed his eyes, he heard a clear voice. What are you doing? Li Yundong opened his eyes and saw Ruan Hongling sitting on the balcony in front of him, looking at him with her legs crossed and her head tilted. Li Yundong subconsciously blamed Ruan Hongling for Su Chan's departure. In addition, she had hurt Su Chan, so he didn't like her very much. Naturally, he didn't have a good face. He said coldly, "What does it have to do with you? I want to build the Zhuji phase. Please leave here and don't disturb me." Ruan Hongling felt Li Yundong's hostility. She snorted coldly and said disdainfully, "You want to build the Zhuji phase like this? Let me tell you, if you build the Zhuji phase like this, it will be strange if you don't go crazy." Li Yundong didn't believe her words. He sneered and said, "What does it have to do with you if I go crazy?" Although Ruan Hongling had a grudge against Li Yundong, she found that this boy had a chivalrous heart and extraordinary courage. He would rather suffer divine punishment than enforce justice on behalf of heaven. She couldn't help but feel that she might have indeed misjudged him in the past. She admired him even more, so she came to remind him out of kindness. But when Ruan Hongling saw that Li Yundong was so kind, she suddenly became furious and said, "How can you bite the hand that feeds you? You don't know how to appreciate my kindness." Li Yundong sneered and said, "Are you a good person? If you were really a good person, you wouldn't have hurt Su Chan indiscriminately, and you wouldn't have." Ruan Hongling was so angry that she jumped off the edge of the balcony without waiting for Li Yundong to finish speaking. She said angrily, Well, I came to advise you with good intentions, but you actually taught me a lesson. Come on, today I want to see whether your Jindan's Yuanqi is more powerful or my Jingyi Junqi is more powerful." Li Yundong immediately stood up and sneered, "Well, I was just looking for someone to vent my anger on." Seeing that the two of them were about to fight, Zi Yuan suddenly appeared between them. The ethereal woman sighed slightly and said helplessly, "You two must have been enemies from 500 years ago. Why are you quarreling as soon as you meet?" Ruan Hongling snorted and turned her face away. Li Yundong also snorted and looked at Zi Yuan. "Are you also here to teach me a lesson?" Zi Yuan looked at Li Yundong, who had a strong rebellious mentality. She sighed softly and said, "I know you are uncomfortable in your heart. You want to succeed in the Zhuji phase immediately, then go through the divine tribulation and find your Su Chan. I also hope that you can successfully build the Zhuji phase and pass the divine tribulation. But you have to know one thing." Zi Yuan's voice was soft and gentle, and there was an indescribable calmness and peace in her tone, which made the depression and anger in Li Yundong's heart slowly dissipate, and his state of mind also calmed down. He was depressed for a while, then said in a low voice, what is it? Zi Yuan said softly, haste makes waste. Look at your current situation. Your heart is full of entanglement, sadness, anxiety, and anger. These are all taboo in cultivation. Li Yundong was not a person who could not listen to words. When he heard this, he immediately fell into silence and did not say a word. Zi Yuan continued, cultivators must maintain a calm and peaceful state of mind. Only when you are in a state of no self, no everything, no other, and no world can you enter the senseless state of having all 6 roots broken. Only then can you succeed in the Zhuji phase. Li Yundong took a deep breath and said in a low voice, does that mean that if I adjust my mentality, I can succeed in the Zhuji phase? Zi Yuan shook her head slightly and smiled faintly. Although your body has been transformed by the Renyuan Jindan and you have a powerful Jindan Qi as your foundation, it is reasonable to say that as long as you stay focused, it should not be difficult for you to reach the Zhuji phase. However, although your cultivation speed is extremely fast, it is all a shortcut. It is not the right way. Therefore, although the Qi you have cultivated is huge, your Dantian has not been consolidated, and your foundation is not solid. Li Yundong couldn't help but say with some dissatisfaction, are you saying that my foundation is not solid? As he spoke, he glanced at Wan Hongling, as if to say, if my foundation is not solid, why did your shimmy run away when she saw me? When Li Yundong glanced at her, Wan Hongling suddenly flew into a rage. Why are you looking at me? If it weren't for the fact that the attribute of your Jindan Qi is the opposite of mine, would I be afraid of you? Li Yundong sneered and was about to speak when he saw Zi Yuan waving her hand to Wan Hongling. Then, Zi Yuan gently pinched her fingers, and in the blink of an eye, a round stone slab about 1 meter in diameter flew in from outside the balcony. This stone slab was about 2 inches thick and was made of marble. It was very hard. Li Yundong recognized it at a glance. Isn't this the top of the stone table in the pavilion of the community? This woman can get this stone slab with a wave of her hand? What kind of magic is this? Zi Yuan pressed the stone slab with one hand, faced Li Yundong, and said, try punching it. Last week, he ranked 9th on the list of flowers. This week, there were 2 updates, on Tuesday and Saturday. This is the first update today, /om/. Chapter 162. Go to watch net. Li Yundong glanced at Zi Yuan and hesitated for a moment. Here. Zi Yuan nodded. Take 3 steps back and then hit this slate with your qi. Don't worry, with your current qi and level of use, you won't be able to break this slate. Go to watch net. 7 KOM. Li Yundong was secretly upset by Zi Yuan's somewhat contemptuous words. He didn't say anything and took 3 steps back. Then, he lowered his eyebrows and shoulders and stood in a bow stance. He took a deep breath, and then with a loud shout, he punched the stone slab. This punch poured out all the depression and anger in Li Yundong's body, and it burst out like a flood. A powerful qi hit the slate with a bang, causing the floor to tremble. Wan Hongling, who was standing to one side, looked down and saw that there was a sunken pit on the surface of the slate. The pit was slightly shaped like a fist, and the pit was surrounded by dense cracks. Amazing. He hasn't even reached the Zhuji phase, yet he has such a powerful qi. Wan Hongling was secretly shocked. What will happen if he succeeds in the Zhuji phase? However, Zi Yuan's face was calm. She turned the slate over and let it stand on its own. Then, she walked to Li Yundong's side, keeping the same distance from him, and said, watch carefully. After that, she didn't use much qi and pushed out her palm. There was a muffled bang, and the slate, which had no one holding it, only trembled slightly. Li Yundong almost sneered in his heart. He thought to himself, you didn't even knock down the slate. Now you're going to make a fool of yourself. Zi Yuan seemed to know what Li Yundong was thinking, so she said to him, don't laugh in such a hurry. Let's go closer and see the difference between the 2 sides. At first, Li Yundong didn't think much of it, but when he looked at the two sides of the slate, he was stunned. Then, he carefully and attentively compared the differences between the two sides of the slate. The more he looked, the more shocked he became, and the more cold sweat he broke out. He saw that the surface of the slate that Zi Yuan's palm had hit had a clear dent, and there was no trace of a crack beside the palm mark. It was as if someone had carefully chiseled a palm mark. How did he do this? Li Yundong felt that his head was full of question marks. It was incredible to the extreme. Zi Yuan said softly, "You must feel very strange. Why is the effect of my fight so different from yours?" Li Yundong nodded involuntarily. Watch net. 7 KOM. Zi Yuan said, "On the one hand, my aura is more feminine, while yours is more fierce. Therefore, my aura is mainly permeating, while yours is mainly destructive. That's why when you see the fist print and the palm print, one has a crack and the other doesn't." Li Yundong suddenly understood and nodded. Zi Yuan continued, "But what I want you to see is not this, but this. Your fist mark is small, so the aura will be more concentrated, but why is it not as clear as my palm mark on the slate?" Li Yundong was shocked and fell into deep thought. Zi Yuan said, "This is because my aura is more solid than yours, and my basic skills are more solid than yours." Only then did Li Yundong believe Zi Yuan's words. He sighed and said, "I've only been practicing qi for about a month. How can I compare to a master like you, who has been practicing qi in his mother's womb?" Zi Yuan shook her head and said, "With the help of Renuan Jindan, your aura is so huge that it has already surpassed those of us who have been practicing qi for more than 10 years. What you need to do is to compress and condense the huge aura in your body. From a scientific point of view, no matter how great the pressure is, it is not as good as the pressure." Li Yundong's heart skipped a beat. He understood what Zi Yuan meant. The damage caused by a fist with 100 kilograms of strength was definitely not as good as that of a finger with 25 kilograms of strength. Seeing Li Yundong's thoughtful expression, Zi Yuan said, "If you can't cultivate your aura to be condensed like a needle, then when you reach the Zhuji phase, your Niden will not be strong enough and will easily become a fake one. Once you meet a strong opponent, you may be beaten until your Niden dissipates, not to mention the terrible divine tribulation." Hearing Zi Yuan's clear explanation, Li Yundong was finally convinced. He asked seriously, "Then what should I do to cultivate the aura in my body to be condensed like a needle?" Zi Yuan smiled and said, "You have to learn from the beginning." When Li Yundong heard this, he suddenly gasped. "Learn from the beginning? No way." Zi Yuan asked in return, "Do you know why there is qi in your body? Do you know where your aura comes from? Do you know why you want to cultivate? Do you know how you cultivate? Do you know what the most important thing about cultivation is? Do you know what the role of the human body's essence, qi, blood, and internal organs in cultivation? Where does one's magic power come from?" This series of rhetorical questions made Li Yundong dumbfounded. He smiled bitterly and said, "I really don't know. But I don't have time to learn these things now." Zi Yuan smiled and said, "Sharpening the knife will not delay the work of cutting firewood. I recommend you to read a supreme book in the cultivation world. You will understand all the truth after reading it. Go to the internet." 7 KOM. Li Yundong's heart was moved, and he couldn't help but look happy. What supreme book? Zi Yuan didn't answer Li Yundong first. She just said to Wan Hongling, "It's not good for us to fly around all the time. If the elders of other sects see us, they will definitely teach us a lesson. Go to the garage downstairs to get the car. We'll take him to buy books later." Wan Hongling responded, glanced at Li Yundong, snorted, opened the door, and walked out. Li Yundong watched Wan Hongling go out. He withdrew his gaze and asked in confusion, "Buy books? You can even buy such a peerless treasure?" Zi Yuan smiled and said, "Of course, and it can be bought everywhere." Li Yundong was stunned, as if he had heard the news of aliens attacking the earth. He said, since it is the supreme book of the cultivation world, shouldn't it be very precious? Why can it be bought everywhere? Zi Yuan smiled and said, the great sound is silent, and the great way is invisible. Our Taoism has declined so far. The world thinks that cultivation is a vague and boundless thing. They either dismiss it as superstition and stupid, or regard it as a fantasy and unattainable. But they actually don't know that cultivation is something that we do in our daily lives. If you read this supreme scripture and do as it says, then everyone can cultivate. Li Yundong was tongue-tied and asked, what kind of book is this? Zi Yuan kept him in suspense and said with a mysterious smile, you'll know when you get there. Li Yundong was curious and felt his heart itch. He couldn't wait to know what this classic book, which was regarded as the supreme book of the cultivation world, was. After waiting for a while, he suddenly heard the sound of a car honking downstairs. Zi Yuan smiled and said, let's go. Hong Ling is waiting for us downstairs. Li Yundong couldn't wait any longer. He rushed out of the door, went downstairs, and got into the car. As soon as he got in the car, he kept urging Zi Yuan, drive, drive. Where are we going? Zi Yuan smiled and said to Wan Hongling, who was sitting in the driver's seat, let's go to the Xinhua bookstore on Renmin Road. Xinhua bookstore? I'm going to faint. Li Yundong almost fainted in the back seat. What's so strange about that? You don't know much. Wan Hongling finally seized an opportunity to mock Li Yundong. Li Yundong was angry and couldn't help but pat the driver's seat in the front row. Hey, are you an adult? Do you have a driver's license? Do you think your parents don't care about you driving? Wan Hongling was so angry that she stepped on the gas pedal. The Hongqi car roared and rushed out. Zi Yuan, who was sitting in the passenger seat, smiled and shook her head. Along the way, Li Yundong and Wan Hongling kept sneering at each other. Sparks flew between the two of them, and smoke filled the air, which made Li Yundong feel a lot better. After a 20-minute drive, the three of them arrived at the entrance of the Xinhua bookstore. Wan Hongling found a place to park the car. As soon as the car stopped, Li Yundong couldn't wait to get out and ran to the Xinhua bookstore. It was as if the supreme book would be bought by someone if he was a second late. Wan Hongling couldn't help laughing again. Don't worry, it can't run away. This book can't grow legs. Li Yundong stopped and retorted bluntly, books don't have legs, but people do. Wan Hongling sneered and said, who would compete with you? You really have the mentality of an ordinary citizen. Li Yundong also sneered and said, yes, I am an ordinary citizen. Why are you following me? Aren't you worse than an ordinary citizen? Wan Hongling was so angry that she went crazy. Who wants to follow you? Go to hell. With that, she stomped her feet and was about to leave. Zi Yuan sighed secretly and said, stop arguing. Hurry up and go in. Li Yundong and Wan Hongling looked at each other, snorted at the same time, and turned their heads to avoid looking at each other. After entering the bookstore, Zi Yuan walked in the front and led the way. Her ethereal temperament and beautiful appearance attracted the attention of everyone in the bookstore for a moment. Even Wan Hongling was a beautiful girl who was no less beautiful than Su Chan. Seeing that everyone was looking at her, Wan Hongling couldn't help but straighten her chest and raise her head. She gave Li Yundong a provocative look, as if to say, I am very charming. Why should I follow you? Li Yundong rolled his eyes. He was secretly worried about the supreme book, so he didn't want to argue with her. When Wan Hongling saw that he was ignoring her, she became even angrier. She secretly gritted her teeth and thought to herself that she must find a way to teach him a lesson later. Li Yundong didn't have the mood to care about her little girl's thoughts. He saw Zi Yuan walking toward the medical section. She walked to a bookshelf, searched for a little, then took down a book and handed it to Li Yundong. Well, this is it. Li Yundong took the book and was stunned. He stammered, no way, just this one? Are you kidding me? Zi Yuan said softly, why would I trick you? This is the supreme book recognized by the cultivation world for thousands of years. It is a cultivation classic that any cultivator must read. Ruan Hongling also interrupted, if you study economics without reading The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, the father of economics, how can you study economics? If you study military affairs without reading Sun Tzu's The Art of War, how can you study military affairs? If you study astronomy without reading Ganda's Ganshe Xing Jing during the Warring States period, how can you study astronomy? In the same way, if you don't read the book in your hand, how can you cultivate the Tao? Although Li Yundong didn't like Ruan Hongling very much, he had to admit that what this bitch said made sense. He looked at the book in his hand and muttered to himself, is this really the supreme book of the cultivation world that they mentioned? Li Yundong was holding a thick book in his hand. This book was packaged in a hard cover, with a brown cover. On the cover were 4 ancient golden characters, Inner Canon of the Yellow Emperor, /OM/. Chapter 163. Go to Watch Network. Zi Yuan saw him looking at the book in his hand with a face full of doubts. She smiled and said, The Yellow Emperor's Canon of Internal Medicine is the first medical work in China. It details the theory of yin and yang and the 5 elements, the theory of pulse, the theory of meridians, the theory of health, and the theory of qi. Go to the network. You can find the answers to the questions I asked you just now in this book. The expression on Li Yundong's face was still strange. He felt like someone had told him that there were immortals in this world, and then he pointed at them. He was shocked to find that the old women wearing red armbands on the side of the road were actually the immortals that this person had mentioned. This was too exaggerated. Li Yundong couldn't help asking, didn't you also say that this is a medical book? How can it be the supreme book of cultivation? Ruan Hongling, who was standing to one side, finally seized another opportunity and said with all her might, Idiot, idiot, haven't you heard of the saying that the Tao is manifested through medicine, and medicine carries the Tao? Li Yundong glanced at her and said, I haven't heard of it, but I've heard of the saying that only women and villains are difficult to raise. Ruan Hongling was so angry that she shouted. She pulled Zi Yuan's arm, pointed at Li Yundong, and said angrily, Sister Zi Yuan, we helped him out of kindness, but he still said such words. Zi Yuan looked at her helplessly and said, Can't you two stop for a while? Then, Zi Yuan explained in detail to Li Yundong, you must find it incredible. Why is such a medical book regarded as the supreme book of Taoism in the cultivation world? Li Yundong nodded. Zi Yuan said, Do you know the origin of our cultivation school? Li Yundong shook his head. Zi Yuan said, as early as the spring and autumn period, Laozi created the Taoist theory with the Tao Te Ching. This school spread to the Eastern Han dynasty and gradually formed a religion. Among them, Zhang Ling believed in Laozi's Taoist theory and then created Taoism. This is the origin of the Taoist cultivation sects in the world. Li Yundong suddenly understood. Ah, I see. It's the 5 pecks of rice sect. Zi Yuan said, yes, but do you know how Zhang Ling founded Taoism in the beginning and how he made so many people believe in him and worship him? Li Yundong's heart skipped a beat. Practicing medicine? Zi Yuan nodded slightly. That's right. This was the Tao manifested through medicine, and medicine carried the Tao. Although there are thousands upon thousands of cultivation methods, and any one of them can allow one to become an immortal or a god when cultivated to the extreme, there are only 2 methods that allow one to become an immortal or a god in the shortest time. One is the Tao of medicine, and the other is. Without waiting for her to finish, Li Yundong quickly continued, the other is martial arts. Zi Yuan looked at Li Yundong with admiration. That's right. Medicine carries the Tao, martial arts protects the Tao. In order to make the world respect you, fear you, and not dare to offend you, it would be impossible for you to not be strong in martial arts. Watch net. 7 KOM. But if you want the world to love you, believe in you, and worship you, you can't just rely on force. Only by practicing medicine and doing good deeds can you do it. Ah, he exclaimed. All of a sudden, he felt as if all of the things that Su Chan had told him in the past had suddenly made sense to him. No wonder the little girl said that Sun Simiao is a god. It turned out that he really became a doctor. Has Sun Lutong also become an immortal? Zi Yuan said, that's right. Sun Lutong, the tiger-head Xiaobai, has reached the peak of martial arts cultivation. Naturally, he entered the Tao and turned to cultivation to become an immortal. Li Yundong slapped his forehead. No wonder the 5 bucketfuls of rice sect was established to help people see doctors for free. It turns out that this is the reason. I thought they were trying to buy people's hearts and usurp power. As he said this, Li Yundong asked in confusion, since they are practicing medicine and doing good deeds, why don't they do it to the end? Why do they have to pay 5 bucketfuls of rice to join the sect? Zi Yuan said, for cultivators, the law is the first, and wealth is the second. If you don't have money, then don't even think about cultivation. This principle is the same as the poor studying and the rich practicing martial arts. The poor can't learn martial arts. Only the rich can practice martial arts because it consumes a lot of the human body's essence. Only the rich can make up for these losses with all kinds of food and medicinal herbs. And cultivation is even more like this. The money consumed is even 100 times more than practicing martial arts. Li Yundong thought of the poorest days when he and the little girl had been together. He nodded sadly and said, that's true, but since the inner canon of the Yellow Emperor is sold everywhere, why don't I see people coming to cultivate it? Zi Yuan sighed softly and said, as the old saying goes, the human body is rare, and the true law is hard to hear. When the Yellow Emperor asked his teacher for advice, his teacher must have asked him to fast and take a bath. He must be respectful before he could teach him the great way. But that was ancient times, when there was a lack of information and resources. But we were born in modern times, with a huge amount of information and explosive knowledge resources. You can't see the true law and the real great way. Zi Yuan stared at Li Yundong and asked, the real knowledge of the great way is by your side. For example, why do you say to close your eyes to rest instead of open your eyes to rest? Why do you say to buy things instead of buying the north and the south? Why do the Chinese characters in China say essence qi, essence blood, sperm, and essence yuan instead of qi essence, blood essence, seed essence, and yuan essence? This series of questions stumped Li Yundong again. He smiled bitterly and said, now that you mention it, I suddenly feel like I'm illiterate. Zi Yuan smiled slightly and said, these are all knowledge of the Great Way. The so-called Great Way is under your feet. You step on it, but you don't notice its existence. As the successor of Jin Dan, you are like this, not to mention those mortals who are usually busy with urban life. We cultivators must ask why when we see something, because only by figuring out the reason can we cultivate without hindrance. After reading this book, will I be able to understand the problems you mentioned? Li Yundong asked. Zi Yuan nodded and said, not only that, but you will also understand the mystery of the human body, the laws and truth between heaven and earth, and then you will understand what cultivation is all about. A thoughtful look appeared on Li Yundong's face. He pressed the inner cannon of the Yellow Emperor with both hands. For the first time, he felt that this book was so heavy. Go to the internet. After a while, Li Yundong nodded and said, I understand. Then I'll go back and read first. He turned around and was about to leave, but suddenly stood still, with an embarrassed look on his face. After a while, he turned around and said awkwardly, I don't have any money with me. Ruan Hongling, who had been silent all this time, burst into laughter and rolled her eyes at Li Yundong. If you don't have money, what can you do? Hongling. Zi Yuan shouted in a low voice, and then said softly to Li Yundong, just read the book in peace. Don't worry about anything else. I will help you solve it. Li Yundong looked at Zi Yuan with a complicated look in his eyes. He was silent for a while and suddenly asked, why are you helping me? Zi Yuan also looked at Li Yundong and said, because I want to find an answer from you. Li Yundong asked, what answer? Zi Yuan smiled and shook her head. You won't understand even if I tell you. Don't ask. Anyway, I won't hurt you. Li Yundong thought for a moment. He thought that he was a bachelor now, and there was nothing to be cheated about. He nodded and said, then I'll thank you in advance. I'll remember your kindness. I'll return it to you later. Zi Yuan didn't stand on ceremony with him. She just nodded and said to Ruan Hongling, go and pay the bill. Ruan Hongling muttered unhappily, Humph, I helped him out of kindness, but I still have to be scolded and pay the bill for him. How can there be such a reason in the world? She walked up to Li Yundong and reached out her hand, shouting, Hey, give me the book. Li Yundong was stunned for a moment and said warily, What are you going to do? Ruan Hongling said somewhat frantically, Pay the bill. You're holding the book. Are you going to pay the bill? Li Yundong said, Oh, and handed the book to her. Ruan Hongling walked to the cashier and paid the bill for Li Yundong. Then, she threw the book back to him and muttered, Take your treasure. Really, who cares about it? I can recite it backwards when I was 7 years old. Ignoring her, Li Yundong opened the book and began to read it carefully. When he got home, Li Yundong sat cross-legged in the living room, still in the habit of meditating in the past, facing east. Then, he began to read the supreme book of the cultivation world eagerly. Li Yundong couldn't remember when he had held a thick book so seriously. He only felt that he had never been so eager to obtain the knowledge of cultivation as he was now. He was like a hungry traveler, pursuing the source of truth on the long road of cultivation. Li Yundong unknowingly saw the evening of the next day. The sky was already dark. Taking advantage of the darkness, Ruan Hongling jumped from her balcony to Li Yundong's. Then, she waved her hand in front of Li Yundong and said, Hey, are you still alive? Only then did Li Yundong wake up. He saw Ruan Hongling standing in front of him, holding a plastic bag in her hand. He was stunned. What are you doing here? Ruan Hongling snorted. I'm here to collect your body. Li Yundong snorted coldly. I'm not dead yet. Thank you. The door is over there. Please close it gently when you go out. Thank you. Ruan Hongling said angrily, If Sister Zi Yuan hadn't asked me to come and see you, do you think I would be willing to come and see your dead face? As she said this, she threw the plastic bag in her hand heavily on the table. Li Yundong raised his eyebrows. Just as he was about to speak, he saw Zi Yuan also flying over from the balcony. Li Yundong couldn't help but smile bitterly in his heart. Why don't these two women have the habit of going through the front door? Zi Yuan said in a low voice, Hongling, cultivators should pay attention to self-cultivation. How can you cultivate with such a bad temper? Ruan Hongling snorted angrily. She pointed at Li Yundong and said, If he hadn't angered me, would I have been so angry? Li Yundong didn't even look at her. He snorted coldly and said, You asked for it. Ruan Hongling was so angry that she stamped her feet. Sister Zi Yuan, look. Zi Yuan smiled bitterly and said, You two should stop talking. As she said this, she looked at Li Yundong and said, You've been obsessed with reading for a day and a night. Do you understand anything? Li Yundong's eyes suddenly lit up. He nodded excitedly and said, I understand a lot of things. For example, the things you mentioned before. Zi Yuan smiled and said, Oh? Why don't you explain it to me? Li Yundong explained, according to the Yellow Emperor's canon of internal medicine, all the 5 senses belong to one place. Among them, the eyes belong to the liver. Once the eyes are closed, it is equivalent to closing the valve of the liver in the body. The blood flow of the human body will slow down, and the consumption of essence will also slow down. In other words, the metabolism will slow down, so the excess strength and energy will be stored. This is the meaning of closing your eyes to rest. Zi Yuan smiled slightly and said, Well, go on. Li Yundong continued, As for buying things, this comes from the corresponding 5 elements of gold, wood, water, fire, and earth in the east, west, south, and north. Among them, things correspond to wood and gold. In ancient times, wood and metal could be made into things and used as commodities for exchange. The north and south correspond to water and fire. Water and fire can't be traded, but gold and wood can. Therefore, buying things does not mean buying north and south. Zi Yuan nodded appreciatively and said, "Well said. Is there anything else?" The more Li Yundong spoke, the brighter his eyes became. He felt that a strange but very familiar door of cultivation was slowly opening to him. The world inside was not something he knew nothing about. On the contrary, it was something he was familiar with, but he had to understand these things from another level. He said, "As for why I say essence, blood essence, sperm, and essence yuan, instead of qi essence, blood essence, child essence, and yuan essence. That's because according to the Yellow Emperor's canon of internal medicine, essence is the most important thing in the human body. Only with essence can there be qi, only with essence can there be blood, only with essence can there be children, and only with essence can there be yuan. Therefore, essence is the first, and it can't be placed behind." Zi Yuan immediately asked, "Then do you know the difference between essence, blood essence, sperm, and essence yuan?" Li Yundong immediately said without hesitation, "Essence refers to the relationship between the kidneys and the meridians. If the kidneys can't contain essence, then the qi in the meridians will weaken. Once this qi is weak, people will have no strength, so there will be a saying that people have insufficient energy in essence." Zi Yuan and Wan Hongling looked at each other, secretly admiring the comprehension and clarity of the young man in front of them. Zi Yuan nodded and said, "Very good, continue." Li Yundong was encouraged, and he became more and more clear in his mind. The things he had been familiar with in the past were suddenly linked to the seemingly illusory things, and he became more and more excited. Li Yundong said, "As for blood essence, it refers to the relationship between the liver and the kidney. The kidney stores essence, and the liver stores blood. Although among the 5 internal organs, the liver ranks higher than the kidney, if people want to produce essence, the liver will produce a large amount of fresh blood, which will then be transformed into essence. Therefore, there is a saying that 1 drop of essence is equivalent to 10 drops of blood. This shows that essence is higher than blood." Zi Yuan nodded with a smile. Li Yundong added, "And sperm refers to the causal logic of reproduction. First there is essence, and then there can be children. The causal logic can't be reversed, so this word can't be reversed either." Zi Yuan smiled and said, "What about essence qi?" "That's not easy to explain." Li Yundong thought for a moment and said, "This is actually very easy to explain, because essence qi refers to the causal logic of cultivation. People must have essence first, so there will be qi, blood, and spirit. If the human body's sperm is constantly consumed, then this person must consume a large amount of qi and blood to produce sperm, which will cause the internal damage and weakness of the human body. This is why it is said that people are emptied by women. According to the theory of cultivation, if a person constantly consumes sperm, then the qi and blood will also be consumed. The 3 essences of the human body, essence, qi, and blood, will naturally be greatly damaged. With this loss, it will be impossible to achieve the 3 essence gathering, let alone refine the 3 essences into divinity. And divinity is the jinqi that cultivators have to refine into. Therefore, without essence, there will be no qi, no essence, no blood, and no spirit. It can be seen that there is a causal logic between essence and divinity. The order of the 2 can't be reversed." When Zi Yuan heard this, she couldn't help but praise, "Wonderful, wonderful. I didn't expect you to understand so many truths in just one day." Wan Hongling also looked at Li Yundong with her eyes wide open and thought to herself, "This person is really talented. No wonder his cultivation progress is so fast. In just one day, he can understand so many truths. Amazing, really amazing, /om/. Chapter 164. Go to Watch Network. Hearing Zi Yuan's praise, Li Yundong smiled and said, "In fact, these principles are very simple. It's like there's only a layer of window paper between us. You can understand it with a gentle poke. Once you understand it, it's not a big deal. Go to watch net." Zi Yuan smiled slightly, looked at the plastic bag on the coffee table in the living room, and said, "This is the food I bought for you. You haven't eaten for a day. Eat it first." Li Yundong only felt excited. He didn't feel tired or hungry at all. He said, "I want to watch it for a while. I'm not hungry at all." Wan Hongling couldn't help but say angrily, "Hey, I worked hard to buy you food, but you don't want it." Zi Yuan shook her head slightly and said softly, "It seems that you still don't understand the inner canon of the Yellow Emperor, nor do you understand what cultivation is." Li Yundong glanced at Wan Hongling and didn't answer her. Instead, he looked at Zi Yuan and asked in confusion, "What do you mean?" Zi Yuan said, "What is cultivation? In other words, what is cultivation? Do you think you have to meditate and practice qi? That's cultivation?" Li Yundong was stunned. "Isn't it? Isn't cultivation the process of turning essence, qi, and blood into God through the process of 3 flowers in one's acupoint and 5 qis collecting in one's head?" Zi Yuan shook her head and said, "This is just the most one-sided understanding of cultivation." As she spoke, Zi Yuan opened the plastic bag, put the lunch boxes out one by one, and put them on the coffee table. She said, "In a broad sense, cultivation is actually a kind of kung fu that conforms to the laws of heaven and nature. Then, by conforming to the laws of heaven and nature, one can find a way to fight against the laws of heaven and nature." Zi Yuan opened one of the lunch boxes, revealing a box of fried lotus root slices. She said, "What is the law of heaven? What is the law of nature?" "The law of heaven is to work and rest according to the normal rules of the sun, moon, and stars. When it's time to sleep, you must sleep, and when it's time to cultivate, you must cultivate." "What is the law of nature?" "The law of nature is that when you are full, don't be greedy, and when you are hungry, you must eat." Zi Yuan put the lunch boxes in the plastic bag and then put the chopsticks in place, like a virtuous wife. As she put them, she said, "You said before that if a person consumes too much sperm, it will cause a great loss of qi and blood in the body, and the whole person will be very weak. Go to watch net. Net. Super_speed. More. Since you understand this, why don't you understand that if a person doesn't eat after mealtime, it will also cause the body's qi and blood to be deficient?" Li Yundong finally understood. He sat down on the sofa obediently, lowered his head, and began to eat without making a sound. Watching him wolfing down his food, Zi Yuan couldn't help but shake her head and say, "You have to eat slowly. Since ancient times, which cultivator ate like you? If you don't chew your food carefully and swallow it slowly, then the food you eat is not fine enough. Your stomach needs to consume a lot of energy and blood qi to grind the food. The strength of the human body is limited. If you spend more energy on digesting food, then you will have less energy to cultivate." Although Li Yundong had some understanding of the inner canon of the Yellow Emperor, he was still not as good as a senior cultivator like Zi Yuan, who had been cultivating since she was in her mother's womb. When he heard Zi Yuan's words, which were easy to understand, he suddenly had a lot of insights in his heart. "Ah, I understand. No wonder some people are prone to stomach problems when they are old. It must be because they consumed too much qi and blood in the digestion of food when they were young." Zi Yuan smiled and said, "There is a reason." Li Yundong was in a daze for a long time, and his eyes became brighter and brighter. It was obvious that he had integrated a lot of things and knowledge in his heart. Seeing that he was lost in thought, Zi Yuan couldn't help but gently knock on the table and say softly, "Eat first." Li Yundong came to his senses and smiled embarrassedly. Then, he took a mouthful of rice and chewed slowly. This time, he chewed very carefully. Zi Yuan knelt opposite Li Yundong and watched him eat intently. Wan Hongling looked bored, so she sat on a chair in the dining room and looked around. After Li Yundong finished eating, he suddenly remembered something. He stood up and said, "Can you take me to a hotel? I need to get something." Ziyuan asked, "What is it?" Li Yundong said, "It's a room that Su Chan and I rented to hide from you. There are things in the room. Go to the internet. 7KOM. Rainbow carrot asterisk literature underscore learning % super hashtag fast. Update. Ziyuan nodded and said, "You can go out for a walk after dinner and exercise your qi and blood." Li Yundong nodded. Before he went out, he suddenly remembered something and handed Wan Hongling's magical item to Ziyuan. "I'll return this to you." Ziyuan smiled in surprise. "Why are you willing to return it?" Li Yundong smiled and said, "No matter what, you have helped me so much now. How can I still take this?" As he said this, Li Yundong said to Wan Hongling, "I'll return it to you. Don't be so rude in the future." Wan Hongling stared at her magical item, her eyes full of surprise. She giggled and said, "That depends on your performance." They went out. When they went downstairs, Li Yundong found that there were many people gathered in the pavilion of the community. Some people were pointing at the stone table and talking about it. Obviously, they were curious about how the palm print on the table had come about. Strange, why is there a palm print on the table after only one day? Who did this? I haven't seen anyone knock on it for a day. Li Yundong glanced at them and smiled in his heart. Then, he got into the Hongqi car. Wan Hongling was still driving. The group of people arrived at the hotel where they had stayed before. Li Yundong got out of the car and went into the room to get his things. Holding the little girl's piggy bank in his arms, he felt a little sad. He stood in the room for a while with a gloomy look on his face. Then, he returned the room card and returned to his home in Hongqing New District. When he got home, Ziyuan, who had followed him into the room, saw the big black iron fan that Li Yundong had placed at the door. She couldn't help but shake her head and say, "The most precious magical weapon of the Fox Zen school has been thrown away by you so casually. I really don't know what the fox with the rock face would think if he were still here." Only then did Li Yundong remember that Su Chan had given him this powerful magical weapon. He walked to the door, picked up the heavy iron fan, and said in confusion, "This thing is so heavy. How can it be a powerful magical weapon?" Wan Hongling, who was sitting on the sofa, sneered and said, "It's just that you don't know how to use it. There are no heavy magical weapons in this world." Li Yundong looked at the big iron fan in his hand. Other than feeling that the big iron fan was exceptionally heavy and that the leaves of the big iron fan were full of golden Sanskrit characters, there was nothing special about it. Ziyuan pointed to the big iron fan and said, "Open the iron fan and have a look." Li Yundong moved his wrist and wanted to open the iron fan, but he was surprised to find that the fan seemed to be rusty and didn't move at all. Li Yundong was stunned. He exerted a little qi and increased the strength in his hand. Only then did the iron fan slowly open. Every time he opened a fan, there would be a clanging sound of friction between the leaves, which was sonorous and powerful. When all the fans were opened, a fan-shaped iron wall appeared in front of Li Yundong's eyes. The wall was full of golden Sanskrit characters, shining with golden light. It seemed that every word was about to come out. Li Yundong stroked the fan with his hand. Although he couldn't understand the meaning of the exquisite Sanskrit characters on the fan leaves, he liked the beauty of these characters very much. The iron fan was cold and delicate to the touch, revealing a deep majesty, which made Li Yundong fondle it fondly. He looked at the powerful magical weapon that Su Chan had left for him before she left, as if he had seen the lively voice and smile of the little girl appear in front of him. For a moment, he was lost in thought and was a little obsessed. Ziyuan said, "Do you still remember what I said?" Li Yundong woke up with a start. "What did you say?" Looking at the majestic iron fan, Ziyuan's eyes were full of admiration. She said, "You have to ask why everything happens. Don't you want to know the name of this iron fan? Li Yundong thought for a moment and shook his head. Su Chan didn't tell me. Zi Yuan said, this iron fan is called the Seven Treasures Psychic Fan. Do you know why it's called the Seven Treasures Psychic Fan? Li Yundong asked, why? Zi Yuan said, this fan was made by Panshir Fox before he became an immortal. In order to remember the kindness of Zen Master Baizhang, he engraved the Vajra Sutra on the treasure fan and added the power of the Supreme Vajra Buddha. Only men with the seven treasures body can use it. Li Yundong asked in confusion, what do you mean that only men with the seven treasures body can't use it? Seeing that he had taken the initiative to ask, Zi Yuan nodded with appreciation. By the way, you can't just know how it is, but not why it is. You have to ask everything clearly. Otherwise, your cultivation will become demonic. Ruan Hongling, who was bored to the side, couldn't help but interrupt, hey, idiot, let me explain it to you. The so-called only men with the seven treasures body can't use it means that Sakyamuni, the old man who valued men more than women, said in the 27th section of the Seven Treasures Theory of Men in the General Theory of the Vajra Heart, that men have seven treasures, while women have five. Zi Yuan couldn't help but glare at Ruan Hongling. Hongling, don't be rude to Buddha. Ruan Hongling said loudly, unconvinced, that's right. Look at the disciples of Gautama Buddha. Which one of them is a woman? Look at the sky full of Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, Vajra Arhats, which one of them is a woman? Isn't Guanyin Bodhisattva a woman? Ruan Hongling burst out laughing and clapped her hands. Are you kidding me? It is said in the Avadamsaka Sutra, a brave and fierce man looks at himself. He, Manjushri Bodhisattva, Samantabhadra Bodhisattva, and Ksitigarbha Bodhisattva are known as the four great bodhisattvas. How could such a mighty man be a woman? Li Yundong looked embarrassed. Although he had read a lot of miscellaneous books, he really didn't know that Guanyin Bodhisattva was actually a man. Is this the legendary ancestor of human demons? Li Yundong suddenly had a very dirty and disrespectful thought in his heart. Shimale is so awesome that everyone in the world worships him. This is probably the highest realm of Shimale, right? No wonder Thailand is a Buddhist and has many transvestites. It turns out that they have a tradition. Then what does this fan have to do with Sakyamuni's preference for men over women? Li Yundong thought for a while, then asked, what does this fan have to do with Sakyamuni's preference for boys, /om/? Chapter 165. Go to watch net. Ruan Hongling snorted with a look of indignation on her face. It's all because Buddha favors men over women, so all the cultivation methods passed down are extremely fierce and masculine. The mystical Silver Fox, the fourth-generation leader of the Fox Zen school, sneaked into Mount Wutai to secretly learn the secret methods of Buddhism. She did learn the Great Vajra technique, but unfortunately, she was a woman. Practicing this cultivation method, she almost died of chi deviation. If Master Huefa hadn't sacrificed himself to save her, how could she have become so famous? When Li Yundong heard this, he couldn't help thinking, it makes sense. Which of the 72 ultimate skills of the Shaolin Temple is not the peak skill of the external sects? I just don't know what kind of magic this Great Vajra technique is. How could a woman suffer chi deviation when practicing it? Go to watch net. 7 KOM. Ruan Hongling continued, because this treasure fan can only be used by men, and men have the body of 7 treasures, it is called the Seven Treasures Fan. Moreover, because it is engraved with the Vajra Sutra and blessed with the power of the Supreme Vajra Buddha, it has a strong protective power and can sense the mind of the master. Therefore, its full name is the Seven Treasures Fan. Li Yunyang closed the fan of 7 treasures and tried it in his hand. Although his strength had increased greatly, he still felt that it was a little difficult for him to bear the weight of more than 50 kilograms in his hand. Moreover, Guan Yu's green dragon crescent blade was only 82 kilograms. Li Yundong waved the fan and heard the low sound of the wind in the air. It was very powerful. After waving it 3 or 4 times, he felt that his arm was a little swollen. He quickly put it down and sighed slightly. No wonder Su Chan said that even the people of the Fox Zen school can't use this magical item. Ruan Hongling snorted coldly and said, "The Fox Zen school has produced a few geniuses, especially the mystical silver fox. Her spiritual power is unparalleled in the world, but now she has declined greatly. It's not easy for Ao Wushuang to appear, but unfortunately." At this time, Ziyuan suddenly interrupted Ruan Hongling. "Hongling, don't talk about other sections." Ruan Hongling made a face at Ziyuan and continued to say to Li Yundong, "Don't think that you're amazing just because you beat me up a few times. In the world of cultivation, men had 7 treasures, while women had 5. It was easy for men to cultivate, but difficult for women. This was a publicly acknowledged fact, so even if you beat me, it would be an unfair victory. Go and flip through the history books. How many mortals have become immortals since ancient times? How many men and how many women?" Li Yundong couldn't help but think to himself, "Isn't that right? Wasn't the 8 immortals in the most popular story, the 8 immortals crossing the sea, one of them? Iron Crutch Li, male. Han Zhongli, a man. Zhang Guolao, male. Lu Dongbin, a man. Han Xiangzi, Imperial Uncle Chao, a man. Lan Saiha, this name sounds like a woman, but it's still a man. Only Immortal Lady he was a woman." Li Yundong thought of something and asked, "What is the body of 7 treasures? What does that mean?" When Ruan Hongling saw that he didn't know anything, she became a little impatient and shouted, "Oh, why don't you know anything? You're so annoying. Sister Ziyuan, you tell him. Go to the internet." 7 KOM. At this time, Li Yundong was eager for anything related to cultivation. He didn't care about Ruan Hongling's attitude, so he turned his eyes to Ziyuan. Ziyuan smiled slightly and explained in a soft voice, "It is said in the general theory of the Vajra heart, once a man has a treasure of ambition, he will wander around fearlessly. Secondly, a treasure with a master, he will be good at balancing. Thirdly, a treasure with a family, he will be good at making money and establishing a career. Fourthly, a treasure with a peaceful life, he will be good at helping the monarch raise his family. Fifthly, a treasure with a sage's wisdom, he will be good at deciding right and wrong. Sixthly, a treasure with a peaceful country, he will be good at making decisions. Seventhly, a treasure with a stable nature, he will be good at making friends with sages. It is a man's body of 7 treasures." Li Yundong nodded. He subconsciously wanted to ask, what does it mean for a woman to have the body of 5 treasures? Since it's hard for women to cultivate, how did you guys manage to cultivate so many magic arts? How could Ao Wushuang be so powerful? However, Li Yundong thought for a moment and felt that such a question might offend Ziyuan, so he held back and kept it in mind. He thought to himself, when I finish the Zhuji phase, I will slowly study these basic theoretical knowledge. Li Yundong asked, "How do I use this iron fan?" Ziyuan said, "This iron fan has 2 uses. One is that it can be used as an ordinary weapon, and the other is that it can be used as a magic item." Li Yundong couldn't help but smile bitterly. "This thing is big and heavy. How can it be used as a weapon? To hit people with it?" Ziyuan looked at Li Yundong, stretched out her hand, and said with a smile, "Would you like to let me use it?" Li Yundong thought that if this woman wanted to snatch it, he wouldn't be able to beat her, so he might as well be generous. Thinking of this, Li Yundong handed over the fan of 7 treasures. Go to the internet. 7 KOM. Although Ziyuan looked thin, like a weak willow in the wind, her slender hand easily held the big iron fan, which weighed more than 50 kilograms. Ziyuan held the fan of 7 treasures in one hand, and then reached out to Li Yundong with the other, saying, "It's too narrow here. Let's go somewhere else and I'll show you." Li Yundong knew that Ziyuan wanted to hold his hand and fly, so he sighed in his heart, "When can I fly freely in the sky?" Ziyuan seemed to have seen through Li Yundong's thoughts, so she said with a smile, "Don't worry, you can fly by yourself in the future." After that, Zi Yuan silently added in her heart, "After you get through the divine tribulation." But how can you get through it? If you can't get through the divine tribulation, how can the words left behind by Master come true? Zi Yuan shook her head slightly, as if she wanted to drive this idea out of her mind. She gently put her hand on Li Yundong's wrist. Li Yundong only felt a sudden warmth in his body, and then he flew up. In the blink of an eye, he flew out of the balcony and landed on the roof. This building was the tallest in Hongqing New area, and there were no buildings that were taller than it. When Li Yundong and the others came to the center of the roof, no one would see them at all. Zi Yuan held the fan of 7 treasures and motioned for Li Yundong to stand a little further away. Then she said, "Look carefully." As she spoke, she held the fan with one hand and shook her wrist. With a swoosh, all the blades of the fan opened. Each blade was like a blade, spinning like a wheel. Li Yundong saw that the fan was flying up and down in Zi Yuan's hand, especially the fan blades. They opened and closed with a swoosh. The top of each fan blade was like a blade. As long as one touched it, not only would one's tendons and bones be broken, but the whole person might even be cut into several pieces. Zi Yuan's steps were quick and ethereal, and her figure was as light as a fairy in the clouds. She moved faster and faster. The big iron fan in her hand moved up and down, and the fan blades opened and closed. The sound was really like thousands of swords being sheathed at the same time. The sound was loud and murderous. The golden Sanskrit characters on the fan blades were floating and flashing, as if they were about to fly out. Zi Yuan waved the fan proudly. The sound of the treasured fan opening and closing was endless, like a continuous string of silk. The dark light of the iron fan almost enveloped Zi Yuan's graceful figure, and the golden characters engraved on the leaves of the iron fan were like a layer of glittering golden cassia, floating in the air like a pagoda. Li Yundong was fascinated by the scene. Even the dazzling computer stunts in Hollywood blockbusters were not as exaggerated as Zi Yuan's fan dancing in front of him. Li Yundong couldn't help but be shocked and excited. It turned out that this seemingly clumsy and heavy iron fan could be used like this. When could he be like Zi Yuan and use the fan of 7 treasures so awesome? As Li Yunyang was engrossed in watching, Zi Yuan suddenly let out a loud shout. Her dancing figure suddenly stopped, and the fan abruptly folded. The dark light that shrouded the surroundings suddenly disappeared, and the golden cassia also disappeared. She stood still with a snap, and the iron fan that was as tall as a person was put behind her. She stood like a pine tree, looking indescribably valiant and heroic. Although Li Yundong had always been on guard and hostile toward Zi Yuan in his heart, at this moment, he was completely shocked by Zi Yuan's fan dance and secretly admired her in his heart. Good! Li Yundong couldn't help cheering loudly. He praised, "It's really like thunder, and it's like the clear light of the river and sea. Amazing, amazing." Although Zi Yuan had been dancing the most powerful part of the fan just now, her whole figure could hardly be seen, and only the scripture pagoda could be seen. However, after she put away the fan, her expression did not change. She smiled calmly and said, "You flatter me." Ruan Hongling looked at Zi Yuan with admiration and said proudly, "My sister Zi Yuan's ability is more than that." Li Yundong nodded in agreement. He asked, "Is this the ordinary way to use the fan of 7 treasures?" Zi Yuan said, "Yes, if you can use this big iron fan skillfully, with your cultivation, even if you encounter some gangsters who want to harm you, as long as their cultivation is not higher than yours by a few realms, you will be able to deal with them." Li Yundong asked curiously, "Then how do I use this fan of 7 treasures as a magical item?" Zi Yuan laughed. She spread out her palm, and the heavy fan of 7 treasures slowly flew toward Li Yundong. She said, "I don't have the body of 7 treasures, so I can't use this fan of 7 treasures. Only men with pure yang qi can use this artifact, so I can't show it to you. Only after you reach the Zhuji phase can you activate the magical item of the fan of 7 treasures." Li Yundong took the heavy fan of 7 treasures and no longer dared to underestimate it because of its heavy weight. He thought of Zi Yuan's fan dance before and couldn't help thinking, now this fan of 7 treasures looks very powerful. If I can use the power of its magical item, what will it be like? Li Yundong couldn't help but feel excited. He wished he could immediately practice according to the method that Zi Yuan had used before. Zi Yuan knew that Li Yundong must be eager to try now, so she didn't disturb him. She waved to Ruan Hongling, and then the two of them flew back to their home. Ruan Hongling couldn't help asking, Sister Zi Yuan, how long are you going to help him? Although this guy looks very smart and has Jindan's yuanqi, he has only cultivated for less than 2 months after all. His foundation is too weak. Even if he succeeds in the Zhuji phase, how will he deal with the heavenly tribulation? Zi Yuan was silent. After a long while, she said, I don't know. I'm just doing my best. If he can't get through the heavenly tribulation, it means that Master's psalm is wrong. If he gets through the heavenly tribulation, then what? Ruan Hongling asked. Zi Yuan sighed and looked at the starry sky in the dark night. I don't know. Ruan Hongling snorted. This hateful guy. We helped him so much, but I still have to endure his anger. I'm so angry. Zi Yuan smiled and said, don't worry. In a few days at most, he will be able to go to the Zhuji phase. You won't be able to see him then. Ruan Hongling was surprised. So soon? Zi Yuan nodded. I will take him to a place, the most dangerous place in the world, but also the best place for the Zhuji phase. Ruan Hongling's eyes suddenly widened. Sister Zi Yuan, are you crazy? How can he go to that place? I'm afraid that he will die before he can reach the Zhuji phase. Zi Yuan said lightly, that depends on his cultivation. If he can't even get through this, how can he face the terrifying heavenly tribulation after the Zhuji phase, /om/. Chapter 166. Go to Watch Network. Early the next morning, Ruan Hongling still jumped from the balcony to the balcony of Li Yundong's house. She stretched her head to take a look, only to find that there was no one in the room. She called out, but there was no response. Ruan Hongling muttered to herself, this bastard hasn't practiced all night, has he? Just as he was hesitating, Ruan Hongling focused her attention and listened carefully. Sure enough, she heard a slight sound of something tearing through the air. Ruan Hongling shook her head and snorted coldly, what a hopeless idiot. I already told him that haste makes waste, but he just doesn't listen. Does he think he can train it in one night? What a fool's dream. As she spoke, she looked around on the balcony. After finding that no one was paying attention, she tapped her toes and flew up to the roof. As soon as she got on the roof, Ruan Hongling's eyes widened. She saw a black ball rolling on the balcony. Countless golden Sanskrit characters were floating outside the black ball. Although it was daytime, they were still shining with golden light, as if they were a layer of golden Buddha characters. The black ball kept making a whistling sound, and sand and stones were flying like a strong wind. There was also a dense clanging sound in the middle of the whistling sound, which was the sound of the iron fan opening and closing. If one closed their eyes and listened, it seemed that thousands of soldiers were pulling out their long swords from their scabbards one after another. The sound was sonorous and murderous. Ruan Hongling's eyes widened, as if she couldn't believe her eyes. She stammered, this isn't him waving the fan, is it? While he was hesitating, the black ball suddenly disappeared. The golden characters around the black ball also floated and twisted for a while before slowly dissipating in the air. In the middle of it, a man with white steam rising from his body appeared. It was Li Yundong. Li Yunyang shook his wrist, and all the leaves of the fan of 7 treasures, which was as tall as a man, suddenly closed. The black light and golden pagoda of the black fan and the golden Sanskrit also disappeared. But with a loud shout, he threw the fan of 7 treasures above his head. With a swoosh, the iron fan opened again in an instant, whistling and spinning violently in the air like a razor that kept spinning. As soon as the fan left his hand, he instantly kicked 3 times in a row, and the bones in his body made a strong and powerful sound. As soon as he finished the 3 kicks, the fan of 7 treasures, which was rolling in the air, suddenly fell down. The sharp edges of the fan rotated at a high speed like a saw. As long as an object was cut by it, even if it was a steel bar, it would immediately be cut in half. Li Yundong saw it accurately. He stretched out his hand toward the flying and rolling fan and accurately pinched the bones of the fan. Then, he spun his feet and exerted force from his waist. The fan suddenly closed with a swish. Li Yundong turned around and retreated. He fiercely smashed the fan of 7 treasures in his hand over his head. The momentum was so powerful that Wan Hongling felt that if he smashed the fan down, the building would be destroyed by him. However, as soon as the fan in Li Yundong's hand was waved in the air, it suddenly stopped, as if the monstrous flood had suddenly turned into a sea of ice and snow, motionless. Go to the internet. From being fierce to suddenly calm, Wan Hongling could only stare blankly. Although she was a cultivator who was good at magic, she was not a layman in martial arts. As the saying goes, 10 Daos, 9 doctors, 10 Daos, 9 martial arts. This meant that 9 out of 10 cultivators knew how to treat diseases, and 9 out of 10 also knew how to fight for self-defense. Wan Hongling knew that it was a little inexplicable that Li Yundong had thrown the fan up just now, but she suddenly saw that after Li Yundong had thrown the fan of 7 treasures up, he had suddenly kicked 3 times fiercely. She couldn't help but cheer in her heart, what a good diversion. But when Li Yundong took the fan, shook his wrist, and closed the iron fan in an instant, Wan Hongling's eyes suddenly lit up. She knew that if someone attacked at this time, Li Yundong could use the sharp edge of the iron fan to cut the opponent. But the best move was Li Yundong's move of turning around and retreating. Martial arts and the art of war were interlinked. When Sun Tzu, the sage of war, wrote in The Art of War, the most brilliant strategy was to escape. No matter how strong the move was, if the opponent dodged or ran away, it would be useless if he couldn't hit him. Li Yundong's turning around and retreating was the best strategy of the 36 stratagems. However, after he turned around, he used the force of the turn to smash the iron fan forward like an iron pillar. This move had the meaning of back thrust and knife-dragging technique. It could be said to be an exquisite killing move. After Li Yundong had completely calmed down, Wan Hongling couldn't help but ask loudly, "How did you become so powerful all of a sudden? Could it be that Sister Ziyuan taught you a few moves last night?" Although Li Yundong had finished the fierce fan dance and the qi in his body was boiling, there was only white steam rising from the top of his head. There was no sweat on his body, and his face was only a little ruddy. He didn't look like a person who had just undergone intense exercise. Go to the internet. 7 K.O.M. Hearing Wan Hongling's voice, Li Yundong turned his head to look at her and shook his head. No. Wan Hongling's eyes widened. Then where did you learn that move just now? Li Yundong said, I figured it out myself. Wan Hongling cried out involuntarily, You figured it out yourself? No way. She looked at Li Yundong in shock and thought to herself, is he bragging? It's one thing for him to practice the fan of 7 treasures so skillfully in one night, but he can also immediately come up with a killing move from the use of this iron fan? Is this guy a freak? Even if he's a genius, he shouldn't be so exaggerated, right? Wan Hongling looked Li Yundong up and down as if she had seen a visitor from outer space. When Ziyuan also went up to the roof, she came to her senses. She took Ziyuan's arm, pointed at Li Yundong, and said, Sister Ziyuan, just now, he. For a moment, Wan Hongling couldn't find the right words to describe Li Yundong. Ziyuan looked at Wan Hongling in confusion. What's wrong with you? Wan Hongling stared at Li Yundong and thought to herself, this guy's cultivation progress is so fast. It won't be long before he surpasses me. Thinking of this, Wan Hongling felt sour in her heart. She said with flagging interest, "It's nothing. You can ask him." Zi Yuan looked at Li Yundong in confusion again. Li Yundong had some respect for this female cultivator who looked like a fairy. He smiled slightly and said, "It's nothing. I just practiced the fan of 7 treasures all night and finally made some progress. I have some experience." Wan Hongling rolled her eyes and thought to herself, "You've practiced so skillfully. How can this be called a little progress and experience?" However, Zi Yuan didn't take it seriously, as if she didn't believe it. There was a hint of blame in her tone as she said, "Why didn't you listen to what you said before? Didn't I tell you that cultivation should follow the way of heaven and the rules? You must sleep when it's time to sleep. Why don't you sleep at night?" Li Yundong smiled bitterly and said, "You two left so suddenly last night and left me alone on the roof. I can go up, but I can't go down." Zi Yuan and Wan Hongling were stunned at the same time. Then Wan Hongling raised her head and burst into laughter. Zi Yuan couldn't help but burst into laughter. She turned her head to the side and covered her mouth to snicker. Li Yundong said helplessly amid the laughter, "I'm alone on this roof. If I don't practice the fan of 7 treasures, what else can I do?" Zi Yuan laughed for a while. She pursed her lips slightly and said with a smile in her eyes, "It's my fault. Now hurry up and go down with us. Have a good rest later. I have something to tell you." Li Yundong nodded, then held Zi Yuan's outstretched hand. After a while, he returned to his home. Zi Yuan said, "This is the time when the yang qi is strong. You can sit facing the east and practice qi. Although it can't make up for the sleepiness caused by you not sleeping last night, it can at least keep you from feeling tired for a day." Li Yundong nodded and did as he was told. Zi Yuan and Wan Hongling looked at each other and left Li Yundong's house from the balcony. Li Yundong faced the rising sun and meditated to practice qi. He only felt that his whole body was warm, as if there was a hot current flowing in his body. Wherever it flowed, he felt comfortable and refreshed, and his fatigue immediately disappeared. He didn't know how long he had been doing this. When he was done, he opened his eyes and found that Zi Yuan and Wan Hongling were staring at him. Li Yundong was stunned. "What's wrong?" Wan Hongling's expression was a little strange and she didn't say a word. Zi Yuan smiled slightly and said, "It's nothing. The Jindan Yuan Qi and Tongzi Yuan Qi in your body are not easy to come by. You should cherish them." "Why does this sound so strange?" Li Yundong muttered in his heart. He didn't answer Zi Yuan's words, but his eyes swept over Wan Hongling's hand. He suddenly smiled embarrassedly and said, "You brought me food again? How can I trouble you all the time?" "Thank you." Wan Hongling snorted and said, "You also know how to say thank you?" After that, she put the plastic bag in her hand on the tea table. Although Li Yundong had been arguing with Wan Hongling for the past few days, Wan Hongling and Zi Yuan had been helping him no matter what. Li Yundong saw this and remembered it in his heart. Although he didn't say it out loud, he was secretly grateful in his heart. Especially towards Zi Yuan, he had a lot of respect in his heart, and even his attitude towards Wan Hongling had improved a lot. Although Li Yundong heard Wan Hongling talk about him, he didn't argue with her. He opened the plastic bag and took out the lunch box inside. He was about to eat when he suddenly thought of something. He looked up and asked, "By the way, have you eaten?" Before Zi Yuan could speak, Wan Hongling snorted and said, "God has pity on you. You also know how to care about others? The two of us are still hungry." Zi Yuan looked at Wan Hongling reproachfully and said to Li Yundong apologetically, "Don't listen to her nonsense. We all ate this morning." Li Yundong laughed and said, "It's noon now. You told me that you ate in the morning. Aren't you scolding me?" As he said this, Li Yundong stood up and said, "Wait here for a while. I'll go out for a while." As he said this, he walked to the door. Just as he was about to go out, he suddenly turned around and said, "By the way, can you come through the door next time? Don't always fly around the balcony like a cat thief, okay?" As he said this, he went out without waiting for Zi Yuan and Ruan Hongling to reply. Ruan Hongling turned her head to look at Zi Yuan and said angrily, "Sister Zi Yuan, he called us a cat thief." Zi Yuan smiled slightly and didn't say anything. Seeing that she hadn't succeeded in fanning the flames, Ruan Hongling rolled her eyes and said, "Sister Zi Yuan, what do you think he's doing?" Zi Yuan said with a smile, "You already know the answer in your heart. Why do you still ask me?" Ruan Hongling giggled and was about to speak when she suddenly heard the sound of a cell phone ringing on the sofa. She turned her head and saw that Li Yundong's cell phone was vibrating on the sofa. Ruan Hongling said curiously, "Hey, who's calling?" As she said this, she picked up the phone and glanced at it, only to see that the caller ID was clearly written, chick/om/. Chapter 167. Go to watch net. Seeing Ruan Hongling pick up the phone, Zi Yuan couldn't help but shout in a low voice, "Hongling, don't touch his things." Ruan Hongling snorted and said, "He also robbed my powerful magical weapon. What's wrong with touching his cell phone?" As she spoke, she pressed the answer button, and then a strange smile appeared on her face, as if she had just pulled a prank on Lin Sanju. Go to watch net. 7ko// As soon as she pressed the answer button on the phone, a soft voice came and said coquettishly, "Sir, guess who I am?" Ruan Hongling could tell at once that it was the voice of the little fox spirit. She sneered and didn't say anything. On the other end of the phone, Su Chan heard that there was no sound from Li Yundong's side, so she thought that he was too excited to speak. She giggled and said, "Can't you tell? It's me, little girl, your little girl." Along the way, Su Chan waited for her master, Ao Wushuang, to leave for a while. Then she immediately picked up her cell phone and secretly called Li Yundong. When she was on the phone, she was still worried that the call would not go through. But as soon as she dialed and said a few words, before she had time to be happy, she heard a woman's cold snort coming from the phone, and then the phone was hung up. This time, Su Chan's mind was like a clap of thunder, which scared her out of her wits. Yundong has a new lover. He doesn't want me? Thinking of this, Su Chan couldn't wait to fly back to Li Yundong's side to see what was going on. But as soon as she thought of this, she saw her master coming back. Su Chan had to quickly hide the phone. Su Chan hid her phone, but she couldn't hide her thoughts. Her mind was filled with the cold snort that came from the other side of the phone. She felt as if her soul had been shattered by that cold snort. Her whole body felt light, and she couldn't even stand steadily. Her mind was a complete mess. Yundong won't really abandon me, will he? No, he wouldn't. But, what if he really doesn't want me? Su Chan's mind was in a mess, and she couldn't help but cry. Seeing her like this, Ao Wushuang couldn't help sighing and saying, "You miss him again?" Sigh, what a sin. Su Chan raised her head and looked at Ao Wushuang with tearful eyes. "Master, can I go back and have a look?" Ao Wushuang said with a cold face, "No, absolutely not. If you go back now, he definitely won't be able to concentrate on building his foundation." Su Chan was panicked and thought to herself, "No, Yundong won't abandon me. I'll make another call later and ask him about it." Watch net. When Ruan Hongling heard that it was Su Chan's call, she wanted to mock her, but just as she was about to open her mouth, Zi Yuan glared at her. Ruan Hongling curled her lips resentfully, snorted, and hung up the phone. Then, she threw the phone on the sofa and muttered, "I really don't know what's so good about this guy. Why do you protect him like this?" Zi Yuan didn't say anything. She just stood quietly in the room with her eyes slightly closed. She closed her eyes to rest. After a while, there was the sound of keys at the door of the room. Li Yundong pushed the door open and walked in, carrying 2 plastic bags in his hand. Ruan Hongling looked at him curiously and said, "Hey, did you go out to buy vegetables?" Li Yundong nodded and said, "Well, although there has been some friction between us, I don't have anything to repay you for helping me like this these days. It just so happens that you haven't eaten yet, so I'll cook a meal for you." Zi Yuan laughed and said, "How can I do that?" Li Yundong smiled and said, "I can't let you two starve and watch me eat alone, can I? Anyway, I've already bought them. You wait in the living room for a while. I'll be back soon." Ruan Hongling asked suspiciously, "You can cook?" Li Yundong glanced at her and surprisingly didn't bicker with her. He just said lightly, "You'll know whether I can or not in a while." As he said this, he carried the plastic bags into the kitchen. Ruan Hongling snorted and muttered in a low voice, "Didn't you say that you had no money? Why do you have money to buy vegetables?" Li Yundong's voice came from the kitchen. "I checked out of the hotel and refunded some money." Ruan Hongling had spoken in a very low voice before, so she hadn't expected that Li Yundong would hear her. She immediately stuck out her tongue. Zi Yuan shook her head at her and smiled helplessly. "Go to the internet." After a while, the sound of vegetables being washed and cut came from the kitchen. Zi Yuan felt a little uneasy, so she stood up and walked into the kitchen. She smiled and said, "Let me help. It's a little embarrassing to sit back and enjoy the fruits of others' labor." Li Yundong smiled and said, "No need. It's better for girls like you not to enter the kitchen." Speaking of this, Li Yundong couldn't help but think of the trouble Su Chan had caused in the kitchen. For a moment, his eyes suddenly became erratic, as if he was thinking about the little things he had done with Su Chan. The expression on his face also became gentle. Zi Yuan smiled and didn't say anything. She just gently rolled up her sleeves with her fingers. Ruan Hongling, who was at the door, said loudly, "Don't look down on Sister Zi Yuan. Her cooking skills are very good. She's definitely better than you." Li Yundong looked at Zi Yuan in surprise. "Oh. I couldn't tell." Zi Yuan smiled slightly and said, "Don't listen to her nonsense. I can only cook a few home-cooked dishes. When I lived alone in the past, I could only cook by myself. Otherwise, I could only eat raw rice. How could I not know a little cooking?" Li Yundong laughed and said, "Why don't you cook 2 of your best dishes, and I'll cook 2 of my best dishes?" Zi Yuan agreed with a smile. It's better to be polite than to be polite. Ruan Hongling clapped her hands and said with a smile, "Great, I can eat the food cooked by Sister Zi Yuan again." Zi Yuan glanced at her, her eyes full of the doting gaze of an elder looking at a naughty junior. Okay, don't make trouble here. Go wait for a while." Ruan Hongling giggled and pretended to run to the living room to wait, but after a while, she slipped back and hid at the door, peeking inside. In the kitchen, Li Yundong was wearing an apron. He looked at Zi Yuan curiously and said, "Don't you want to wear an apron?" Zi Yuan shook her head with a smile. She stretched out her slender hand, picked up a white radish from the plastic bag, and gently washed it with water in the pool. Li Yunyang saw that even though the woman was washing vegetables, she still exuded a kind of otherworldly elegance. Her soft hands, which seemed to be spotless, gently swept over the radish, and the radish seemed to become spotless, exuding a kind of spiritual immortal qi. Li Yundong was amazed in his heart. He turned his head and began to concentrate on cutting the vegetables in front of him. Ruan Hongling, who was at the door, saw that Li Yundong and Zi Yuan were busy in the kitchen at the same time. They were both immersed in their own work. Occasionally, they would look up at each other, smile at each other, and then pass the knives to each other. Especially when Li Yundong began to cut and stir-fry vegetables, his skilled and delicate knife skills and the way he weighed the pot made Ruan Hongling couldn't help but nod. She thought to herself, this guy also knows a thing or two. I just don't know how the food he makes tastes. The two of them were busy in the kitchen for about 20 minutes. Li Yundong made braised crucian carp, sweet and sour ribs, and tomato egg soup, while Zi Yuan made stir-fried lotus root slices and stir-fried shredded radish. Ruan Hongling looked at the 4 dishes and 1 soup on the table and couldn't help laughing. What a blessing. I haven't eaten hot dishes for a long time. Li Yundong couldn't help asking, don't you usually eat hot dishes? Zi Yuan smiled faintly and didn't say anything. Ruan Hongling continued, Sister Zi Yuan has already reached the state of fasting. It doesn't matter if she eats or not. As for me, I don't know how to cook for myself, so I have to eat junk food outside all day long. Li Yundong smiled. He picked up a piece of stir-fried lotus root with his chopsticks and chewed it in his mouth. He immediately felt that it was light and tasteless. Not only did it seem that there was no salt in it, but it also seemed that there was no monosodium glutamate in it. Although the taste was bland when it first entered his mouth, Li Yundong almost wanted to spit it out. However, he chewed a few more times out of politeness, and he slowly recalled the unique fragrance of lotus root. The more he chewed, the sweeter it became, as if his lips and teeth were filled with fragrance. Li Yundong couldn't help but praise, amazing, amazing. I didn't expect you to be so beautiful and have such exquisite cooking skills. This dish seems to have almost no oil, salt, or monosodium glutamate, but it tastes elegant and fragrant. This kind of skill is the skill of a top chef. I can't compare with it. Li Yundong thought to himself, as the saying goes, words are like the person, and writing is like the person. In fact, cooking is the same. Zi Yuan's dishes are so fresh and elegant. It can be seen that she must also be a pure and elegant person. Zi Yuan's smile was very modest and peaceful. She smiled and said, I'm sorry. Ruan Hongling's first bite was of Li Yundong's dish. After only 1 bite, her eyes couldn't help lighting up. She praised loudly, delicious, delicious. Zi Yuan also reached out her chopsticks and picked up a piece of fish. She tasted it and said with a smile, it's really good. However, she thought to herself, this dish looks, smells, and tastes good, but the taste is a little strong, and the heat is a little rushed. It can be seen that there is still a fire in Li Yundong's heart that has not been extinguished. The more Ruan Hongling ate, the more she praised him. Her cultivation skills were far inferior to Zi Yuan's, so she liked to eat the slightly stronger dishes made by Li Yundong. She ate heartily and couldn't help but praise him while thinking to herself, this guy does have some advantages. I wonder if Sister Zi Yuan will really fall in love with him. Thinking of this, Ruan Hongling couldn't help looking at Li Yundong and Zi Yuan up and down. She saw that one of them was handsome and heroic, exuding a masculine aura from head to toe, while the other had an otherworldly temperament. His every move was full of an ethereal aura that didn't belong to the mortal world. The more Ruan Hongling looked at them, the more she felt that the 2 of them were really a rare perfect match in the world. She muttered to herself, is the psalm left by Master true? Li Yundong didn't know what she was thinking. He saw Ruan Hongling's eyes constantly rolling around him, so he couldn't help but say, why are you looking at me? I'm not a dish. Ruan Hongling smiled, glanced at Zi Yuan, and said meaningfully, you are indeed not my dish. You are someone else's dish. Under the table, Zi Yuan quietly stepped on Ruan Hongling's foot. Ruan Hongling immediately shouted in an exaggerated manner, Sister Zi Yuan, why did you step on me? Zi Yuan's ears suddenly turned a little red, and she glared at Ruan Hongling angrily. Li Yundong was confused and didn't know what these 2 beautiful women were doing. Just as he was about to speak, he suddenly heard his cell phone ring from the sofa. He walked over to take a look and was shocked. He pressed the answer button with his trembling hand and said in a trembling voice, little girl? Su Chan, who was frightened on the phone, burst into tears when she heard Li Yundong's voice. Sir, I miss you, /om/. Chapter 168. Go to CNET. Li Yundong suddenly received a call from Su Chan, which was really a pleasant surprise. However, when he suddenly heard Su Chan burst into tears, he suddenly panicked. He walked to the balcony and whispered, girl, what's wrong? I miss you too. Su Chan was scared at first, but she finally found an opportunity to call Li Yundong's cell phone. She was afraid that no one would answer, and she was also afraid that another woman would answer the phone. While waiting anxiously, the little girl finally heard Li Yundong's familiar and gentle voice. She suddenly couldn't help crying. Go to CNET. 7 KOM. Su Chan sobbed and said, Master, do you not want me anymore? Hearing Su Chan's voice, Li Yundong's heart ached a little. The longing that had been suppressed because of the high-intensity cultivation in the past few days was suddenly aroused. He said softly, Don't be silly. How could I not want you? Hearing Li Yundong comforting her, Su Chan wiped her tears and said, There are so many beautiful women around you all day long. Will you fall in love with them? Li Yundong suddenly felt happy in his heart. He couldn't help laughing and said, Jealous? Not bad. Didn't you always push me to other beautiful women before? Su Chan sniffled and choked, You're so annoying. Answer my question first. Li Yundong smiled and said, Silly girl, there are so many beautiful women in the world, but I only like you. Su Chan was overjoyed when she heard this. Holding the phone, she couldn't help but smile. Why? Li Yundong said softly, Because the girl has been with me from the beginning. Su Chan giggled when she heard this. She remembered the woman's cold snort when she answered her phone and couldn't help curling her lips. Then why was there another woman talking on your phone just now? Li Yundong was stunned. Another woman? No, I just received your phone call. I just went out to buy vegetables. Su Chan pouted and said, But there was a woman who answered my call before you. She snorted and hung up. Humph, Li Yundong couldn't help but look back at the living room. Ruan Hongling had been paying attention to Li Yundong. She felt a little guilty in her heart. When she saw Li Yundong looking at her, she immediately avoided his eyes. Watch net. 7 K.O. Hong O. Li Yundong was not stupid. He immediately understood what was going on. Although he was angry in his heart, he did not show it on the phone. He still said in a soft voice, It should be someone else who answered the phone. She seemed to have thought of something and asked tentatively, Yundong, is Zi Yuan teaching you cultivation now? Li Yundong paused. How did you know? Su Chan giggled. There's nothing I don't know. There's nothing I don't know. Li Yundong laughed and said, Wow, you're so shameless to blow the conch. Your master must have told you. Su Chan didn't blush. She giggled and said, My master is so smart. As the little girl spoke, she suddenly rolled her eyes and said, You went out to buy vegetables just now. Were you cooking for Zi Yuan and the others? Li Yundong smiled and said, My girl is also very smart. You got it right on the first try. Su Chan snorted and said sourly, I want to eat it too. I haven't eaten your food for several days. I'm craving it. Li Yundong laughed and said, Okay, when you come back, I'll cook for you every day. Su Chan was overjoyed. That's what you said. Pinky swear. The girl's sweet and innocent tone made him feel as if Su Chan was standing right in front of him. She leaned forward slightly, then stretched out her little finger and looked at him with a sweet smile. Her eyes were like two crescent moons when she smiled. Li Yundong couldn't help but become lively and gentle. He subconsciously stretched out his hand, hooked it with his little finger, and said softly, Pinky swear for 100 years, don't change. Su Chan also said on the phone, Pinky swear for 100 years, don't change. As they spoke, although both of them were holding their phones, they felt as if the other party was standing right in front of them. Their voices and smiles were lifelike and within reach, and an invisible thread pulled them together tightly. Go to watch net. 7 KOM. Net. Super_speed. More. New. Su Chan giggled and said, Okay, I believe you. But, Yundong, Ziyuan is a powerful figure that my master can't stop praising. You have to learn more from her. She comes from a famous and decent sect, so she is definitely more suitable to teach you than me. Li Yundong smiled and said, but I'd rather you teach me. Su Chan giggled and said, really? Why do I feel like I don't know anything? I'm just making trouble for you. As Su Chan said this, she suddenly exclaimed and said anxiously in a low voice, my master is back. I'll hang up first. As she said this, she pressed the phone, then turned around and hid it behind her back. Although Ao Wushuang hadn't seen Su Chan make the phone call, she had been through it. When she saw Su Chan's guilty look, how could she not understand what a little girl like her was doing? Ao Wushuang smiled and didn't say anything. She walked up to Su Chan and spread out her hands. Under the pressure of Ao Wushuang, Su Chan didn't dare to resist at all and obediently handed over the phone. Ao Wushuang looked at Su Chan with a face full of disappointment and scolded, I've only been out for 2 minutes, and you can't wait to contact your lover. Not bad. You've been out for a few months, and you can even use a mobile phone. Do you really like him or do you really hate him? Su Chan lowered her head, and her chin was almost touching her chest. She rubbed the ground with her toes, rubbed the corners of her clothes with both hands, and said pitifully, I like him. Ao Wushuang said angrily, if you like him, then hold back. Don't contact him. Do you want to hurt him? Su Chan responded in a low voice, oh. But after a while, she raised her head timidly and asked weakly, then, Master, when can I contact him again? Ao Wushuang snorted and said, wait until he passes the divine punishment. Oh, Su Chan said and lowered her head. After a while, she raised it again and asked weakly, then, Master, how do I know when he will pass the divine punishment? Ao Wushuang looked at Su Chan speechlessly. You are a three-tailed spiritual fox. Why are you acting like an idiot who has just entered the cultivation world? When the divine punishment comes, how can the cultivation world not know about it? Oh, Su Chan said again and lowered her head. But after a while, she raised it again. Just as she was about to speak, she saw Ao Wushuang glaring at her angrily. Su Chan was so scared that she quickly lowered her head again. She didn't dare to raise it no matter what, but her eyes were rolling in their sockets. She looked around with shifty eyes, as if she was thinking about something. After a while, Ao Wushuang handed her a train ticket and said, let's go. I just got the ticket. Su Chan took the train ticket, looked at the destination, and said strangely, Master, what are we going to Dongwu City for? Ao Wushuang sighed and said, why don't you want to make progress at all? How can our Fox Zen school have such a strange person like you? Do you want your lover to leave you far behind in the future? Are you going to leave your cultivation behind? In the end, don't become a burden to him. Su Chan suddenly raised her head and asked in surprise, Master, where are you taking me to cultivate? It's a good place for cultivation. Now that you've entered the secular world, I think you won't be able to stop if I take you back to the mountains. You might as well cultivate in Dongwu City. I also have a place to stay there, so you can cultivate in peace. Ao Wushuang nodded and said, Dongwu City is a 1,000-year-old ancient city with deep qi veins, beautiful mountains and clear waters, and a beautiful place for outstanding people. Su Chan smiled in surprise and said, then can I tell Yundong where I'm going first? Ao Wushuang was furious. B****, you're so sentimental. What kind of cultivation do you have? Su Chan lowered her head and pouted. She looked unconvinced and muttered, aren't you the same? Ao Wushuang was immediately defeated by Su Chan. She rubbed her temples, sighed helplessly, and said, save it. When his divine punishment is over, he will naturally know where you are. Su Chan blinked her eyes and responded. After a while, she asked again, Master. Ao Wushuang was a little crazy. What else? Su Chan asked weakly, why do we have to take the train? Isn't it better to fly? Ao Wushuang pointed to the sky and couldn't help but say angrily, "You fool, don't you see that there are so many dark clouds in the sky? It's summer now, when there are the most heavenly thunder. Do you want to fly up and be struck by lightning?" Su Chan shrunk her head and mumbled, "Didn't I forget?" Ao Wushuang was so angry that her phoenix eyes widened. "Are you deliberately annoying me?" Su Chan immediately took Ao Wushuang's arm with a smile and said coquettishly, "No, I wouldn't dare." Ao Wushuang loved her disciple very much. Otherwise, she wouldn't have protected her in every way. She would rather risk her life to lead the pursuers away and let Su Chan go alone with the Renyuan Jindan. She couldn't stand the little girl's coquettishness. As soon as Su Chan acted like a spoiled child, the anger in her heart dissipated. Although she still couldn't pull her face down, there was a faint smile in her eyes. "Humph, you don't dare? Is there anything you don't dare to do?" As she spoke, she shouted, "Hurry up and pack your things. Follow me quickly. Aren't you afraid of missing the train?" "Oh," Su Chan said and began to pack her things in a hurry. But after a while, she suddenly stopped, turned her head, and said with a groan, "Master, I'm hungry." Ao Wushuang threw a plastic bag over and said, "Let's eat this." Su Chan opened it and was immediately disappointed. "Ah. Xiaobing? It's still cold." Ao Wushuang said angrily, "I made this myself. It's good to have something to eat. You've never been picky before. Do you want to eat it? If not, give it back to me." How could Su Chan be willing to give it back? It was better than nothing. She immediately put on a protective look and took a bite. Suddenly, there was a cracking sound, and a tooth was almost broken by the hot xiaobing. The little girl let out a cry and covered her cheeks. She thought of the delicious food that Li Yundong had made for her in the past, and then looked at the cold and hard xiaobing in front of her. She didn't know how many years it had been there. Suddenly, she felt sad. Her eyes were full of tears, and her heart was cold. The more Su Chan thought about it, the sadder she became. She couldn't help curling her lips and saying, "It's not as delicious as Yundong's food." Ao Wushuang looked at her and couldn't help laughing out loud. Evil disciple, /om/. Chapter 169. Go to watch net. After Su Chan hung up the phone, Li Yundong returned to the room and looked back and forth at Zi Yuan and Wan Hongling with an unfriendly expression. Go to watch net. Zi Yuan and Wan Hongling were both cultivators, so they had excellent hearing. They had clearly heard what Li Yundong had said before. Therefore, one of them looked magnanimous, while the other looked sneaky. Li Yundong's heart was as clear as a mirror. Li Yundong's eyes were so sharp that Wan Hongling couldn't help but slap the table and say, "Well, stop looking. I answered the phone before. What do you think?" Li Yundong said angrily in a deep voice, "Why did you answer my call? And why did you hang up with a snort?" Wan Hongling had never been questioned by a boy like this before. She immediately stood up and said loudly, "I just don't want to see you abandon yourself and hang out with those evil monsters." Li Yundong saw that not only did she not apologize, but she also said such words. He immediately became furious and said, "It's none of your business who I'm with. Please don't meddle in other people's business in the future." Wan Hongling had been secretly praising Li Yundong in her heart, and her impression of him had greatly improved. But at this time, she suddenly felt that the man in front of her was simply the most hateful person in the world. She couldn't help but say angrily, "Who wants to meddle in your business?" "Bah! If it weren't for Sister Zi Yuan, I wouldn't have bothered to talk to you." As she said this, she turned her head and rushed to the balcony, jumping back. Zi Yuan looked helplessly at Li Yundong, who was still angry, and sighed slightly. "Why do you have to do this?" Li Yundong said angrily, "It's fine if I don't settle the score with her for hurting Su Chan. How can she touch my personal belongings? What right does she have to touch my things? Didn't her parents discipline her well? Zi Yuan sighed and said, Hongling's parents died when she was a child. I brought her up. If you want to blame someone, blame me. Although Li Yundong was angry, he still respected Zi Yuan very much. He just turned his head to the side and didn't say anything. Zi Yuan thought for a moment and said, although time is still a little tight, if you keep practicing here like this, the effect won't be very good. Why don't you go to Tibet tomorrow? Li Yundong asked in surprise, why are you going to Tibet? Zi Yuan said with a serious expression, cultivation. Li Yundong became more and more confused. Why do you have to go to Tibet to cultivate? When cultivators reach the Zhuji phase, they often choose to do so on the mountain. Do you know why? Li Yundong shook his head. I don't know. Watch net. Zi Yuan said, because the mountain is the place where the spirit qi in the world gathers the most. Not only is the air good, but it is also closer to the imperial court of cloud sky, so it is easier to feel the power of the sky and the earth. The higher the mountain, the more it is like this. Li Yundong's heart skipped a beat. He could vaguely feel her intentions. He asked tentatively, do you mean that I should go to the Zhuji phase on the mountain in Tibet? Zi Yuan nodded. Times are different now. Basically, the famous mountains have been greatly contaminated by the world, but the mountains in Tibet have not. They are still pure. Therefore, you can go there to cultivate your foundation. Li Yundong thought for a while, then sighed and said, that's good, but I don't have the money to go. Zi Yuan smiled and said, why, do you still want to fly over? No, you can run there yourself. Li Yundong was dumbfounded. Run there? You must be joking, right? No, I'm not joking at all. Zi Yuan stopped smiling and said solemnly, although the Jinqi in your body is majestic and strong, it is not condensed. You can take advantage of the journey to slowly temper the Jinqi in your body, especially the first time you run. Don't stop. Run as long as you can until you can't stand it anymore. By the way, bring your fan of 7 treasures with you. Li Yundong thought that he would have to carry the fan of 7 treasures, which weighed more than 50 kilograms, all the way to Tibet. He couldn't help but shiver and stare blankly. Seeing his expression, Zi Yuan was not surprised. She just said softly, if you don't go through the bone-chilling cold, how can you smell the fragrance of plum blossoms? Don't think that cultivation is a very simple thing. It is the most difficult way of heaven in the world, so naturally, it has to go through the most tests. If you feel that you can't hold on, think about the agreement you made with Su Chan. Li Yundong's heart suddenly trembled, and his eyes gradually revealed a firm look. He nodded to Zi Yuan and said, I understand. Where am I going in Tibet? Zi Yuan smiled slightly. Where is the highest in Tibet? Li Yundong said in surprise, you don't mean Mount Everest in the Himalayas, do you? Zi Yuan smiled and said, where else is higher? Li Yundong smiled bitterly. You don't want me to climb to the top of Mount Everest to build the Zhuji phase, do you? I'm afraid I'll freeze to death before I can climb to the top of the mountain. Zi Yuan said, you don't have to reach the top of the mountain. When you climb to a certain level, the Jinqi in your body will have a strong reaction, and then you can start building the Zhuji phase. Go to the internet. 7KOM. I can't tell you the specifics. You're the only one who knows this kind of thing best. Li Yundong took a deep breath and said, I understand. When should I go? Zi Yuan thought for a moment and said, you can prepare first. Tomorrow. Li Yundong was stunned. Tomorrow? So soon? Zi Yuan looked at Li Yundong seriously. Do you think there's still a lot of time left for you? Li Yundong didn't say anything. He went back into the room and began to tidy up his clothes. Zi Yuan stood outside the door and watched for a while. Seeing that Li Yundong had sorted out a lot of things and even stuffed his notebook into his bag, she couldn't help saying, just prepare 2 sets of clothes. don't bring too many things. Just the fan of 7 treasures is enough for you. Li Yundong was stunned for a moment, then began to clear out the things in the bag. He only prepared a few sets of clothes, then he thought for a moment, poured a few bottles of water, and put them in the bag. Li Yundong was busy for a while, and suddenly remembered a very important thing. He only had a few hundred yuan on him. How could it be enough to spend on the way? Zi Yuan seemed to notice what Li Yundong was thinking. She said, "Are you worried that the travel expenses along the way might not be enough?" Li Yundong smiled awkwardly and said, "Yes, I only have a little money on me." Zi Yuan said, "You're not thinking about buying food when you're hungry and finding a hotel to sleep when you're sleepy, are you?" Li Yundong couldn't help but ask, "Are we going to go there on an empty stomach all the way? Sleep when you're sleepy?" Zi Yuan didn't answer and asked, "Do you know how I cultivated back then?" Li Yundong shook his head. Zi Yuan said, "At that time, I begged alms all the way and walked more than 2,000 miles. When I was hungry, I found food on the ground. When I was thirsty, I drank water from the mountains. When I was sleepy, I found a place to sit down and take a nap. It took me 35 days to reach my destination." Li Yundong couldn't help but look at her in shock. He couldn't imagine how a fairy-like woman like her, who had an otherworldly temperament, could complete this kind of ascetic monk-like cultivation. Zi Yuan said, "Every year, the Buddhist disciples of the Lamaism have to walk 1 or 2,000 kilometers in order to make a pilgrimage. They are much more miserable than us, but there are still countless devout believers who go to the snow mountain every year. Even mortals like them can stand it. As the successor of Jindan's stage, can't you stand it? If you can't stand it, how can you stand it when the divine tribulation comes? When heaven is about to give a person a great responsibility, it must first satisfy his will, tire his muscles and bones, starve his skin, empty his body, and mess up his actions. Therefore, it is necessary to be patient and do what he can't do." Zi Yuan said word by word, her tone unprecedentedly solemn. "Don't think that cultivation is the easiest thing in this world just because you've reached the sky in one step. On the contrary, if you haven't experienced real sharpening and you meet a strong opponent in the future, even if your spiritual energy surpasses that of others, it will be easy for your will to be destroyed and defeated, because you haven't experienced real sharpening." Li Yundong suddenly became solemn. He nodded and finally treated this cultivation as the most difficult thing in his life. He first sat down and thought about it carefully, then suddenly stood up and went to the room to find a pair of scissors. Then, he cut open a few pieces of his clothes and wrapped the cut strips of cloth around the fan of 7 treasures. Zi Yuan looked at his movements and nodded secretly. There was a hint of appreciation on her face. "By the way, this fan of 7 treasures must not be seen by others. Otherwise, if other cultivators see it, they might be tempted by the treasure and try to snatch it." After Li Yundong wrapped the fan of 7 treasures, he made a strap with a thick strip of cloth and carried it on his back. He walked around the living room, tried to run, and jumped a few times. Then, he took off the fan of 7 treasures and readjusted the length of the strap. When he felt that it could be carried on his back diagonally, he nodded in satisfaction. Zi Yuan watched him walk to the door, squat down, and begin to put on his shoes. She asked in confusion, "You don't want to go out now, do you?" Li Yundong didn't look back, and there was a rare firmness in his voice. "As you said, I don't have much time left. If I delay 1 more second, I will waste 1 more second. Anyway, I've eaten today, so I might as well go out now." As he spoke, Li Yundong had already put on his shoes. He stood up, stamped his feet, and then looked at Zi Yuan. "Is there anything else I should pay attention to?" Zi Yuan thought for a moment and said, "Don't be nosy on the way, especially after entering Tibet. Try not to get in touch with the locals and don't get into disputes with them. Everything is about cultivating the Zhuji phase. When you complete the Zhuji phase, I will come to find you." Li Yundong nodded. He carried his tidied clothes and the fan of 7 treasures on his back. Before he went out, he looked back at Zi Yuan and nodded. Well, thank you. Zi Yuan smiled slightly. You don't have to thank me. I'm also doing it for my own cultivation. Li Yundong was stunned, but he didn't have time to think about it. He just said goodbye to Zi Yuan and went out by himself. After leaving Hongqing New Area, Li Yundong immediately ran to the nearest newsstand and bought a map of the whole country and Tiannan City. He looked at the map for a while, confirmed the direction, and then began the long and arduous journey of cultivation. He was carrying a big iron fan that was nearly as tall as a person and wrapped tightly with cloth strips. There was also a bundle hanging on the big iron fan, which looked strange and immediately attracted the attention of the passers-by. Li Yundong felt a little strange under these gazes. He couldn't help but speed up his pace. As he ran, Li Yundong suddenly thought of what Zi Yuan had said to him, "Run all the way, this can temper your zhenqi." Although Li Yundong didn't understand why running could temper his zhenqi, he still did it. In the early summer of June, on the streets of Tiannan City, a young man carrying a heavy luggage was running quickly, attracting the attention of many passers-by along the way. The sun was hanging high in the sky. Li Yundong couldn't help but raise his head and look at the vast sky. This was the first time he had gone so far alone, and it was the first time he had gone to such a far place with 2 legs. He couldn't help but sigh and feel confused. Where was his path? What would this cultivation journey be like? How would he build the Zhuji phase when he reached the Himalayas? He didn't know. He didn't know any of this. The only thing he knew was that if he wanted to know the answer, he could only slowly explore and explore on the journey. This was not only the first long journey in his life, but also the first journey he had embarked on the road of cultivation. No one knew how far this young man would go in order to become stronger. /om/ Chapter 170. Go to CNET. In the past, when Li Yundong was an otaku, he had never thought that eating and sleeping were also a kind of cultivation. Even running was a kind of cultivation. Ever since Li Yundong had read Inner Canon of the Yellow Emperor, although he couldn't fully understand all the content in it for a while, he relied on his strong memory to forcibly memorize the content in his mind. In the future, he would naturally understand it slowly. Go to CNET. When he first started running, he didn't feel anything strange about his body. This was because his body had been transformed by the Renyuan Jindan to become extraordinarily strong. This kind of strength not only included strength, but also a strong adaptability and durability. Ordinary people could carry 100 kilograms of things, so Li Yundong could carry 500 kilograms of things. Ordinary people would gasp for breath after running 500 meters, but Li Yundong could still run 5,000 meters in one breath without a change in his expression and heart rate. But when Li Yundong carried the psychic fan of 7 treasures, which weighed more than 50 kilograms, and ran for nearly 10 kilometers, he began to feel that there was a stream of hot air constantly rising in his body. This hot air continued to expand, turning his chest and internal organs upside down. This feeling made Li Yundong very uncomfortable at first, just like what he had experienced when he went on a rampage in school. It was as if he had become a pressure cooker, and his body was full of swelling hot air. The more he ran, the more swollen it became. Li Yundong wanted to tear all his clothes and then cut open his chest to let the qi in his body leak out. Li Yundong wanted to stop and let the qi in his body slowly calm down, but he suddenly remembered what Zi Yuan had said, "Don't stop the first time you run. Run as far as you can until you can't stand it anymore." Li Yundong gritted his teeth and continued to run like this. After running for another 5 kilometers, Li Yundong was already out of the city. He began to feel hot all over, and each of the 36,000 pores on his body felt as if they were being pricked by needles. It was painful and itchy. Li Yundong couldn't help but feel a little shocked. He couldn't understand why such a situation was happening. But when he thought about the Inner Canon of the Yellow Emperor he had read, he unconsciously searched his mind for the knowledge in it to explain such a phenomenon. After thinking for a while, Li Yundong really couldn't stand the feeling of the manic heat surging in his body. His pores opened, and his body began to sweat. Go to CNET. 7:00/ As soon as he started sweating, Li Yundong suddenly felt that the stuffy feeling in his body had lessened a little. Li Yundong's spirit was greatly lifted. Suddenly, his heart skipped a beat. He seemed to understand why Ziyuan had asked him to run to cultivate his body. When a person's pores open, the primordial qi in their body will flow out, and running will make all the muscles and internal organs in the body move, forcing the pores all over the body to open and excrete the primordial qi in the body. Vitality was a person's most precious essence. According to the theory of health maintenance, vitality was the amount one had at birth. It could not be increased, only decreased. Some people were born with a lot of vitality, while others had less. It was like a gas tank. Some gas tanks were big, while others were small. As he ran, Li Yundong thought to himself, witnessing his own self-enlightenment. People who don't know how to cultivate have no way to increase their own yuan qi. Yuan qi will only slowly decrease with the passage of time. Why were children's eyes so black and bright? And why did many people's eyes become dimmer as they got older? Because children had the most vitality, their eyes were black and bright. As they grew older, they didn't pay attention to cultivating their body and mind. As a result, the yuan qi in their body would be lost, causing their eyes to lose their luster. One of the most important things to control the yuan qi and prevent it from easily leaking out was, don't sweat. When people were young, their yuan qi and energy were the most abundant, so they often didn't pay attention to this point. They would easily sweat all over, as if they had just taken a bath. Little did they know that this was a matter of great damage to their yuan qi. As Li Yundong ran, he thought about these questions in his mind. He was an extremely smart person. Just a little bit of advice from Ziyuan had allowed him to understand a lot of problems at once. He thought, why are many sports athletes in poor health when they get old? If there was something wrong with them, then there was something wrong with them. Part of the reason was that the high-intensity training had caused some damage to their bodies, but another very important reason was that they had perspired too much when they were young, and their pores had opened too much. Their vitality had been greatly damaged, and as a result, their bodies were empty and there was no qi to rely on when they were old. Moreover, why do many weak people feel dizzy after taking a hot bath for a long time? Because the pores had been open for too long, the primordial qi in the body had escaped. Watch net. 7:00. Thinking of this, Li Yundong had unknowingly run another 5 kilometers. If it had been in the past, he would have been tired and out of breath after running 2 kilometers. But now, Li Yundong only felt that the qi in his body was surging, as if there was a high-speed motor running in his body. The qi in his body was ting-ting-ting, driving his body, making him run more and more powerful and comfortable. At this time, Li Yundong finally understood what running is also a kind of cultivation meant. Ordinary cultivators were afraid of perspiring and opening their pores because they were afraid that their essence qi would leak out. At this time, he was afraid that the boiling yuan qi in his body would not be able to get out. It was like a pressure cooker. If the heat kept increasing and expanding, the whole pot would explode. But if there was a leak, the pot would not explode. As Li Yundong ran and sweated, the boiling qi in his body immediately found a place to vent. His whole body became a huge cauldron with a lid. Guhong, the great master of the Danding sect at the end of the Eastern Han dynasty, believed that the human body was a big cauldron. If people wanted to cultivate Niden, they had to use essence and qi as the medicine guide, and use their spirit to burn and refine, and finally cultivate the human Niden. The basic skill of cultivation was the process of refining the essence and qi of the human body into Niden. Previously, Ziyuan had thought that although the Jinqi in his body was vast, it was not condensed. But at this time, when he started running violently, the Jinqi in his body surged and rolled, and his whole body became a pressure cooker. A huge pressure was produced in his closed body, constantly washing his meridians and squeezing the jinqi in his body. This was the same as stewing bones in a pressure cooker. If you didn't use a pressure cooker, it would take nearly an hour or two to stew the bones completely. But if you used a pressure cooker, the bones would be rotten after a while. This was the case in Li Yundong's body at this time. His body was the pressure cooker, and the jinqi in his body was the bones. Before he knew it, Li Yundong had run nearly 30 kilometers along the main road. It was noon, and Tiannan City was a southern city. It was already very hot in June, and the sun was shining brightly. Li Yundong felt as if he had just been fished out of the water. There was not a single dry spot on his body. Every time he stepped on the pavement, he would leave a footprint on the pavement. Li Yundong was so tired that he looked like he had just been fished out of the water. Although Li Yundong was sweating all over, he did not feel tired at all. Instead, the more he ran, the more energetic he became, and the more he ran, the brighter his eyes became. While running, Li Yundong could not only feel that the jinqi in his body was like fine steel that had been tempered thousands of times, constantly being knocked and impacted. He could even clearly feel that his internal organs were constantly wriggling, shaking with the heat in his body. Li Yundong couldn't help but think, why do so many people who love to exercise rarely get sick? Because when they exercise, the internal organs in their body will also wriggle. Although this kind of wriggling is far from comparable to the movement of muscles, it is also a kind of exercise. Every exercise will mobilize the primordial qi in the body to gather in these organs, making them constantly stronger. This principle was the same for people who learned to sing. Even if their voices were damaged in the beginning, it did not matter, because the vocal cords would become stronger and thicker the more they practiced. The internal organs of the human body also worked the same way. Li Yundong knew that at this time, the organs in his body were constantly wriggling, constantly replenishing the various organs with primordial qi. This kind of exercise was 100 times, or even 1,000 times stronger than that of ordinary people. With the medicinal power of Renyuan Jin Dan, Li Yundong's exercise for an hour was equivalent to that of ordinary people for a month. His exercise for a day was equivalent to that of ordinary people for a year. When Li Yundong ran like this for another 10,000 meters, he began to feel a dull growling sound coming from his stomach. At first, Li Yundong thought that he was hungry, but he soon realized that something was wrong. The sound in his stomach was getting louder and louder, and with every sound, he felt his body tremble. The sound was like rolling thunder in the distant sky, deep and dull, like the roar of a tiger or leopard in the depths of the mountains. Could this be the tiger-leopard thunder sound? A thought flashed through Li Yundong's mind. As a professional otaku, Li Yundong had been watching Jin Yang's wuxia novels since the first year of high school. Even now, he was still a martial arts fan. Of course, he was no stranger to the tiger-leopard thunder sound. Li Yundong had once read The Lost Martial Arts World by Li Zhongshuan, the last disciple of Master Shang Yunxiang. In this book, Li Zhongshuan asked his master Shang Yunxiang, "What is the tiger-leopard thunder sound?" Shang Yunxiang picked up a cat and placed it in Li Zhongshuan's hands, saying, "This is the tiger-leopard thunder sound." Li Zhongshuan was instantly enlightened. Cats, leopards, and tigers were all feline animals. They all had one thing in common, and that was that their stomachs would constantly produce a low, deep sound. This sound was the sound of their internal organs constantly wriggling, like rolling thunder in the distant sky. That was why it was called the tiger-leopard thunder sound. The low, deep sound in Li Yundong's stomach was the state that most martial artists were unable to reach, the tiger-leopard thunder sound. Be it cultivators or martial artists, it would take years, or even decades, of painstaking effort to master the tiger-leopard thunder sound. It took only a day for Li Yundong to master it. While Li Yundong was shocked, he also sighed at the wonders of the Renyuan Jin Dan. Without the Renyuan Jin Dan, he would never have been able to master the tiger-leopard thunder sound. His internal organs were constantly wriggling, and Li Yundong could clearly feel his bones and muscles swelling. This feeling of swelling was not painful. Instead, it was full of power. Li Yundong could feel that the qi in his body was flowing rapidly at this time. Part of the qi was leaking out of his pores, excreting the excess qi, while the other part of the qi was driving his blood to flow quickly. The more Li Yundong ran, the more comfortable he felt. The more he ran, the more energized he felt. His running speed was comparable to that of a normal person sprinting for 100 meters. This terrifying speed shocked some of the passers-by on the road, and they almost caused a car accident. Suddenly, Li Yundong felt that perhaps this cultivation was not an extremely arduous journey. On the contrary, he was enjoying it, and he would never get tired of it. /om/ Chapter 171. Go to watch net. He hadn't expected that he would run for a day and a night. Even when he was thirsty, he only slowed down a little. He took a bottle of water from his backpack and took a sip. Then he didn't even put the bottle back. He held it in his hand and continued to run. Watch net. 7 km. Li Yundong's frantic running along the way attracted the attention of many drivers. Some of them even deliberately slowed down their cars to follow Li Yundong, wanting to see how long this young man could run. But after following him for more than 10 minutes, some of them realized that this young man, who was carrying a luggage bag wrapped tightly with a cloth strip, was actually walking at a fast pace, as if he was sprinting. There was no sign of him slowing down at all. After following him for an hour, Li Yundong's speed was still so fast. These drivers were all stunned by Li Yundong and almost had an accident. How could a human run so fast for so long? Could it be that this young man is from the national track and field team? While Li Yundong was drinking water, some kind-hearted drivers took the opportunity to ask loudly, "Young man, do you need a ride?" Li Yundong waved his hand with a smile, wiped the water from his mouth, and continued running. Under the training of the tiger-leopard thunder roar, Li Yundong's internal organs became stronger and stronger. The qi in his body, which was already very strong, also became more and more vigorous. At this time, Li Yundong completely understood why Zi Yuan had asked him to run all the way. It turned out that when he ran, his qi and blood would boil with it, and when he deliberately controlled the boiling qi in his body, he could constantly train the qi in his body. Long-distance running was the process of constantly tempering his internal organs and 8 extraordinary meridians. It was like building a dam in the upper reaches of the Yangtze River. At first, not a single drop of water was allowed to flow out, so the water accumulated more and more, and the water pressure became stronger and stronger. But when the water pressure exceeded the level that the dam could bear, the dam began to automatically drain water to prevent it from being broken by the flood. Watch net. This was the reason why Li Yundong began to sweat. When the human body's pores opened, it was as if the dam had opened the gate, and the accumulated water gushed out of the dam. When the water gushed out, the human body would spontaneously thicken and strengthen the dam again, and the water that could be stored would be a little more than the last time. When it couldn't stand it anymore, the dam would be opened again, and the excess water would pour out again. In this process, Li Yundong could feel that the more he exercised, the more vigorous the qi in his body became. The more he was hammered, the more condensed it became. At first, it was like a rushing Yangtze River, but slowly, it became like high-pressure water gushing out from a pipe. The force was frightening. Even on the second day, he began to notice that he could control the opening and closing of his pores. He could control where he wanted to sweat and where he didn't want to sweat. After discovering this, Li Yundong's heart skipped a beat. He began to gradually close some of his pores to prevent the yuan qi in his body from leaking out. This undoubtedly increased the pressure in his body. The opening of the dam, which could originally pour out 1,000 cubic meters of water in a minute, was now reduced to only 500 cubic meters. The water pressure from this opening was naturally twice as strong as before. As the pressure increased, the impact on the meridians in his body naturally increased as well. The pressure on his internal organs also increased. For example, he originally had to withstand a pressure of 100 pascals, but now because of the increased pressure, he had to withstand a pressure of 200 pascals. This kind of sudden doubling of pressure was very similar to Sun Wukong's cultivation in the training ground in Dragon Ball, where the gravity was doubled. Although it was hard, the effect of cultivation was extremely obvious. When Li Yundong was running for the third day, his clothes had already been wet and dry. He had repeated this more than dozens of times, and his clothes were covered with sweat and salt stains. Watch net. 7 km. On the third day, Li Yundong could already control the pores all over his body. Only 10% of the pores were open for the qi to pour out. This meant that he could already adapt to the rolling qi under 10 times the pressure. Most importantly, during the continuous running, Li Yundong felt that the qi in his body was like a soldering iron that was constantly being beaten on a chopping board. The more it was beaten, the harder it was, and the more it was tempered, the stronger it was. His internal organs and 8 extraordinary meridians were also like a stronger and stronger dam, constantly increasing in height and thickness. It was not until the night of the third day that Li Yundong felt that he had begun to overdraft. Only then did he slowly slow down and stop by the side of the road. Li Yundong closed his eyes and adjusted his qi a little. After calming down the rolling qi and blood in his body, he carefully looked around. He found that he had run at least hundreds of kilometers away and was already on the ground of another province. Li Yundong stretched his body and smiled. He walked off the highway and found a hidden place to sit cross-legged and meditate for the whole night. That night, when Li Yundong was meditating, he could clearly feel that the qi in his body was much stronger than before. Moreover, when the true qi in his body flowed, it was not as easy as it used to be to move his whole body, like a monstrous flood. Although the true qi in his body was as strong and majestic as before, this qi was not like before, which came like thousands of galloping horses and left like a chaotic army. Instead, it had become like a condensed long snake, iron chain, and steel whip. When it left, it was like a dragon swinging its tail, leaving no trace. It was like a ragtag army that, after going through training, had begun to become a well-trained and orderly regular army. When Li Yundong opened his eyes again, it was already dawn. He stretched lazily. When he passed the highway checkpoint, he saw someone selling lunch boxes on the side of the road. He used the little money he had on him to buy one. Fortunately, the food in the mainland was slightly cheaper than in the southern cities. It only cost 5 or 6 yuan. Li Yundong looked at Li Yundong, who was sitting at the checkpoint. After Li Yundong finished his meal, he tidied up his luggage and spent 2 yuan on 2 bottles of water. After that, he continued his journey. Li Yundong went through Jiangxi, Hunan, Sichuan, and finally arrived at the border of Tibet. It had been a whole month. During the past month, Li Yundong had been living in the open. He had even sold his mobile phone for money. All his money had been used to buy some dry food and clean drinking water. During the past month, Li Yundong had completely changed. In the past, Li Yundong had smooth skin, a handsome face, and a strong body. Although he did not pay much attention to his appearance, he was always well-dressed and clean. But now, because of the long exposure to the sun, Li Yundong's skin had become bronze. His clothes had become ragged and dirty, especially the white salt on his body, which could not be washed clean after several times. His clothes had become a little white, and the sneakers on his feet had long been worn out. He could no longer wear them, so he had to throw them away and become a pair of bare feet. Li Yundong ran barefoot all the way. At first, there were countless bloody blisters on his feet, which made him grimace in pain. But after a few days, these bloody blisters had become thick calluses, and he got used to walking barefoot. His hair had grown crazily in this month. His long hair had grown over his shoulders, and it was as messy as a chicken nest. His face was unshaven, and he had grown a full beard. At first glance, he looked like a savage who had just come out of the mountains. Although he had suffered for a month, during this month, Li Yundong could only open the Baihui acupoint on the top of his head to pour out his qi. At the same time, he closed all the pores on his body. The qi in his body had been condensed like a reinforced iron pillar, powerful and not dissipating. Li Yundong didn't even know to what extent the qi in his body had become at this time, nor did he know what kind of lethality and destructive power he would have when he condensed his qi and punched. But Li Yundong knew that compared with a month ago, he was completely different. As the saying goes, the edge of a treasured sword is sharpened, and the fragrance of plum blossoms comes from the bitter cold. When Li Yundong arrived at the Belongu area of Biyao County in western Sichuan, he finally stopped running. He looked around and found that although he was still in Sichuan, the customs here were very similar to those of the Tibetans. Many people were dressed very similar to the Tibetans. When the locals looked at a savage like him, their eyes were curious and vigilant. Li Yundong didn't care about these people's gazes and opinions. He just looked at the map and then walked in the direction of Mount Duonian. Along the way, Li Yundong found that some devout lamas were constantly walking up the mountainside. They were wearing dark red and bright yellow clothes and gloves on their hands. They prostrated themselves on the ground all the way, looking extremely devout and solemn. Fortunately, there were also tourists among these people, so Li Yundong, an alien, was not very eye-catching. However, his dirty and shabby clothes always attracted the attention of other tourists from time to time, and their eyes were full of disgust and contempt. Li Yundong glanced at them and suddenly understood the meaning of Tang Bohu's poem, "The world laughs at me for being too crazy, and I laugh at them for not being able to see through me." These people all thought that Li Yundong was a beggar begging for food along the way. They all looked at him with disgust, afraid that he would come over and ask them for money. But who knew that Li Yundong was actually a cultivator who was hiding his strength and cultivating hard? Li Yundong sneered inwardly and continued to climb along the hillside in silence. When he was almost halfway up the hillside, a noise attracted his attention. /om/ Chapter 172. Go to watch net. Li Yundong looked in the direction of the noise and saw a group of people gathering on the road halfway up the mountain. There were pilgrims in lama clothes, and there were also travelers in various costumes. Watch net. 7 KOM. These people were surrounding a girl who looked to be about 17 or 18 years old. This girl was dressed in white Tibetan clothing and was squatting on the ground. Her hair was full of thin braids. Her appearance was delicate and pretty, and her face was rosy, revealing a healthy youthful color. However, her expression looked very mournful. She was hugging a motionless old man and crying loudly. The old man was wearing a yellow and red lama robe. His face was full of deep wrinkles, and he looked to be in his 70s or 80s. Like the other pilgrims, he wore gloves. There was a thick layer of black callus on his forehead, and there were obvious abrasions on his chest and knees. He was obviously a devout pilgrim, but he might have fallen here because his body was too weak during the journey. The girl hugged the old man's body and cried. Some of the surrounding Buddhists sighed softly, while others spun the prayer tubes and softly chanted scriptures. These people were all talking in Tibetan. Li Yundong was confused and couldn't understand a word. Just as he was about to turn around and leave, he saw a few people squeezing in from outside the crowd. Two of them were foreigners with deep eyes and high noses, and a black-headed Chinese man. The two foreigners and the Chinese woman were all carrying huge luggage bags, wearing travel clothes specially made for mountaineering, and wearing big sunglasses. After they squeezed into the crowd, the Chinese woman squatted down and said to the Tibetan girl in Tibetan, "What happened here?" The girl raised her head and looked at them with teary eyes. "My Chambajila has gone to see the living Buddha. He left me alone on the pilgrimage." "Who are you?" The Chinese woman pointed to the two foreigners behind her and said, "They are mountaineering enthusiasts, and I'm their language interpreter and guide. I know a little about first aid. Do you mind if I show him?" The girl carefully looked at the two foreigners, her eyes full of vigilance and doubt. Seeing this, the two foreigners took off their sunglasses and greeted her in a friendly manner. Watch net. 7 K.O. Hong O.M. The girl thought for a moment and finally nodded. The female tour guide stretched out her finger to the old man and checked his breath and pulse. She frowned and turned to look at the two foreigners for help. She shook her head slightly. One of the brown-haired foreigners came forward, squatted down, and pressed his hand on the old man's neck artery. He also frowned slightly. He pressed his hand on the old man's chest and gave him heart compressions for a while. He also did artificial respiration for a while, but the old man did not move at all. The brown-haired foreigner was busy for a while. There were beads of sweat on his forehead. He looked up and shook his head helplessly. The female tour guide sighed and said to the girl, "I'm sorry, we can't do anything. He's gone." Although the girl already knew that the old man had passed away, she couldn't help but burst into tears when she heard the confirmation. Li Yundong frowned as he watched from the side of the road. He subconsciously wanted to go and have a look, but he remembered that Zi Yuan had once told him not to meddle in other people's business on the road. Thinking of this, he wanted to leave. Moreover, Li Yundong vaguely felt that someone in the crowd was coveting him. He glanced around and found a rover parked in the distance. A young man and a woman were sitting in the car, looking at him with bright eyes. When the young man and woman saw Li Yundong's gaze, they couldn't help but look away. This situation made Li Yundong frown. He subconsciously became vigilant in his heart and turned to leave. But as soon as he turned around and took 2 steps, the girl's sad cry came, making Li Yundong feel very uncomfortable. He suddenly remembered the scene of Su Chan crying in his arms. Li Yundong hesitated for a while and struggled in his heart for a long time. In the end, he sighed slightly, turned back, and walked toward the crowd. Li Yundong was dressed like a savage. Although he didn't smell, he looked very sloppy. The people around him avoided him, afraid to get close to him, as if he was a god of plague. Watch net. 7 K.O.M. Li Yundong walked up to the old man and was about to reach out his hand when he heard the two foreigners shouting. The female tour guide also looked at him with disgust and said loudly, "Death is the most important thing. What are you doing?" After saving Hardadef and Chow Kefi, Li Yundong already had some experience in such things. He turned his head to look at the female tour guide and saw that the woman had a decent appearance and looked quite beautiful. He was too lazy to answer her. He continued to stretch out his hand and help the old woman sit up. The surrounding Tibetans burst into an uproar and began to criticize him loudly. However, most of them spoke in Tibetan, and Li Yundong couldn't understand a single word. However, the girl could tell from his dress that Li Yundong looked like a Han, so she shouted in Chinese full of hostility, "What are you doing? Don't touch Chambajila. His soul has gone to see the living Buddha. You can't touch his body like this." Li Yundong glanced at the girl, smiled, and didn't say anything. He reached out his hand and pressed it on the old man's head. A strong and condensed Yuanyang genuine qi surged into the old man's body. When the surrounding Tibetans saw Li Yundong's appearance, as if he looked down on all of them, they were all angry. Some of the young people even wanted to come over and fight. The two foreigners also looked frightened. For fear of being implicated, they stood up one after another, waved their hands, and shouted, "No, no." The female tour guide also shouted, "Don't be impulsive, don't be impulsive." But what could the 3 of them, outsiders, do? The Tibetans were aggressive and united. They were very xenophobic. They didn't care about the 3 of them and rushed up to beat Li Yundong. Li Yundong was angry in his heart. He raised his head, and the Jinqi in his body moved to his eyes. He rolled his eyelids, and his divine eyes swept over the people around him like lightning. Before Li Yundong had cultivated hard, his gaze could still make ordinary people tremble with fear. At this time, after a month of hard cultivation, the Jinqi in his body had been like hard pig iron, but now the Jinqi in his body was like fine steel that had been tempered 100 times. It was extremely hard and strong. Li Yundong's gaze swept across the crowd. Suddenly, everyone felt a pain in their eyes, as if they had seen the sun. It was so painful that they couldn't open their eyes. Their hearts beat wildly, and they immediately stopped and covered their eyes. They didn't dare to go forward, let alone shout at Li Yundong. The people around saw this abnormality for a moment, and they all looked at Li Yundong with doubt and awe. They moved further away from him. Only the girl kept her big eyes open and stared at Li Yundong without showing any weakness. When Li Yundong saw the girl, it was as if he had seen Su Chan. He didn't care about the girl. He just smiled at her gently, then lowered his head and continued to transfer Yuanyang Jinqi into the old man's body. The Jinqi in Li Yundong's body was so strong that he didn't need to use the three-pronged flower technique. He just pressed the old man's Baihui acupoint with his palm, and he could transfer the pure and vigorous Yuanyang in his body into the old man's exhausted meridians and internal organs. This vigorous Yuanyang qi was like the spring rain that moistened the dry land, slowly restoring the old man's vitality. Chinese medicine believed that only when the Yuanyang in a person's body was completely exhausted could the person be considered dead. Therefore, there was a saying that people had run out of luck. Such people could not be saved even by God. However, the old man's body couldn't bear the pain of the pilgrimage. For a while, he couldn't adjust the little Yuanyang in his body, so he suddenly died. Although his situation was similar to Chao Kefi's, he was old and not as young as Chao Kefi. His body had not yet been exhausted. As soon as Li Yundong's vigorous Yuanyang qi was injected into his body, the old man reacted strongly and woke up immediately. After Li Yundong injected the Yuanyang qi into the old man's body, he could clearly feel that his Jinqi was like a sharp tentacle, exploring the old man's body. He began to feel that a little Yuanyang qi hidden deep in the old man's body was mobilized by him and began to gush out, responding to his Jinqi and nourishing the organs in his body. Li Yundong nodded to himself, knowing that the old man had been saved by him and would wake up soon. He gradually returned the qi to his body. After that, he didn't say goodbye to the people around him. He turned around and continued his cultivation journey. These Tibetans looked at Li Yundong's back as he left and cursed. Even the female tour guide, who was his compatriot, looked at Li Yundong's back with disgust and snorted coldly. "You didn't know anything, but you messed around. You almost caused trouble." Only the girl looked at the old man in front of her with shock and ecstasy. She opened her mouth and couldn't say anything for a long time. When the people around saw her like this, they also looked at the old man curiously. They saw that the old man's pale and gray face had begun to slowly become ruddy, and his chest had begun to rise and fall slowly. The female guide and the two foreigners stared, as if they couldn't believe what was happening in front of them. Without waiting for the girl's consent, the female guide reached out her hand and pressed slightly near the artery on the old man's neck. Her eyes suddenly widened and she cried out involuntarily, "He came back to life?" The two foreigners couldn't believe it. They had personally confirmed the old man's death before. How could he suddenly come back to life? The girl supported the old man with a face full of ecstasy and shouted, "Changbajila, wake up, wake up." The surrounding Tibetans saw it clearly. Under the girl's shout, the old man's eyelashes began to tremble, as if he would open his eyes at any time. They all looked happy and shouted, "Changbajila, wake up." The crowd's shouts were like a shot in the arm. After a while, the old man suddenly exhaled a mouthful of turbid qi, opened his eyes, and woke up. With tears in her eyes, the girl shouted happily and threw herself into the old man's arms. "Changbajila, I thought you were gone. Meiduo was scared to death by you." The old man looked around in confusion and suddenly said, "How could I be here? I clearly saw the living Buddha enlightening me just now and sending me to the Western paradise. How could I be here in the blink of an eye?" The surrounding Tibetans were all shocked and asked, "Changbajila, did you see the living Buddha?" The old man nodded firmly and solemnly. "Yes, I saw the living Buddha, /om/." Chapter 173. Go to the net. Did Chambajila really see the living Buddha? It's possible. I once heard from Japugla that when people are about to die, they can see the gods and Buddhas. But why did Chambajila suddenly come back to life? That's possible. Maybe the living Buddha cured him. Well, it's possible. But just now, only that Han teenager touched Chambajila strangely. After a while, he recovered. Could it be that he's the living Buddha? Impossible, impossible. He's a Han. How could he be the living Buddha? The Tibetans surrounded Chambajila and whispered to each other. When Chambajila heard their words, he shouted unhappily, "That's not right. Buddha said that all living things are equal." Where did the Han and Tibetans come from? Chambajila was very prestigious among these Tibetans. As soon as he spoke, they all shut up, but there was still a look of disapproval on their faces. Achanjum Chambajila sat for a while and gradually regained his strength. He stretched out his hand and gestured for Meduo to help him stand up. Meduo said nervously, "Chambajila, you haven't recovered yet. You'd better sit down and rest for a while." Chambajila laughed. The deep wrinkles on his face were like blooming chrysanthemums. "I'm very good. I haven't felt as comfortable as I do today for more than 20 years. As he spoke, he was about to stand up. Meduo, who was beside him, was very nervous, so she helped him stand up. As soon as he stood up, Chambajila asked Meduo, "What on earth happened?" "I only remember that I seemed to have suddenly fainted during a pilgrimage. Then I saw the living Buddha standing behind me and giving me enlightenment." Meduo's eyes widened. She pointed to the two foreigners and the Chinese female guide and said, "Chambajila, they felt your pulse and tested your breath. They said that you had already gone to the Western Paradise." Chambajila politely put his palms together and bowed to the two foreigners and the Chinese female guide. "Tashi Delek, thank you for your help." After the two foreigners listened to the translation of the Chinese female guide, they quickly put their palms together and bowed in return. Chambagra straightened his back and asked, "Did anything else happen after that?" Meduo hesitated for a moment and said, "A dirty Han man squeezed in and touched your head with his hand. Then he left." Chambajila's eyes lit up. "And then?" he asked. Meduo said with a puzzled expression, "And then you woke up." Chambajila became excited and asked loudly, "Where is this person now?" Meduo pointed in the direction of the mountainside. "He went there." Chambajila stomped his feet and said, "Meduo, what did I teach you? Why didn't you leave him behind? That's my savior. He is the living Buddha that I saw." Before Meduo could say anything, the surrounding Tibetans widened their eyes and said one after another, "Chambajila, are you confused? How could that Han man be the living Buddha?" Chambajila said loudly, "I was about to go to Elysium when he put his hand on my head and I came back to life. Even Master Jalila Tenzin can't do such a thing. If he's not the living Buddha, then what is he?" Chambajila's words made everyone look at each other in dismay. Their hearts began to waver. One of them said in a low voice, "Yeah, this guy just touched Chambajila's head, and Chambajila came back to life. This kind of method is too unimaginable. If he's not the living Buddha, then what is he? How can the living Buddha be a Han man? Oh, no matter what, I think Chambajila's life was saved by this Han man. Yes, I think this man is the living Buddha among the Han people." It was difficult to persuade these people. An old Tibetan looked at Chambajila and said, "Chambajila, you are the leader of our pilgrimage. You should tell us what to do." Chambajila's face showed an embarrassed expression. He thought to himself, "It stands to reason that we should catch up with him immediately and express our gratitude to our benefactor. However, pilgrims must bow every 3 steps on the pilgrimage journey. If we don't do this, it will be a great disrespect to Buddha, and we won't be able to escape to Elysium when we die. But if we bow every 3 steps, how can we catch up with this benefactor?" Chambajila looked embarrassed, but Meduo said considerately, "Chambajila, I think he is also going to Kathoda Temple. He will definitely rest there for a while. Maybe he will still be there when we get there. Chambajila sighed and said, that's the only way. Let's go. 7 K.O.M. As he spoke, he turned his face again and kept lecturing Meiduo. Why didn't you stop him back then? Did you have a preconceived notion because he was a Han person and have other ideas in your heart? Meiduo glanced at Chambajila timidly and shook her head weakly. No, it's just that he's too dirty. Chambajila couldn't help but say angrily, I'm still dirty. I've been worshipping all the way here. Which part of me isn't dirty? Which part of you isn't dirty? D*M. Buddha said that all living beings are equal, that there is no distinction between high and low, and that there is no distinction between beauty, ugliness, and cleanliness. As my disciple, how dare you say such a thing? Don't you know that Buddha used to beg along the street and was unkempt? Meiduo, a young and beautiful girl, was reprimanded by Chambajila in front of everyone. Her eyes immediately turned red, and tears welled up in her eyes. She didn't dare to refute. She just took Chambajila's hand and said softly, Chambajila, don't be angry. If we meet him later, I'll apologize to him. You've just recovered, so don't be angry. We can't do without you. Chambajila said angrily, what if we don't meet him? I'm telling you, if we don't meet him, you will have committed an evil deed, and there will be retribution in the future. Meiduo couldn't hold it in any longer. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but she had a strong personality. She turned around and secretly wiped her tears, not wanting anyone to see them. The Tibetans on the side tried to persuade him. Chambajila, don't talk about Meiduo anymore. You almost went to paradise before. You don't know how sad she was. Maybe we'll meet this Han person up ahead? Chambajila snorted and said, what if we don't meet him? The crowd looked at each other and kept silent. Chambajila stopped talking. He faced the direction of Mount Duonyen, put his palms together, raised them above his head, and knelt on the ground. Then, he kowtowed to the ground, touched his mouth, and prostrated himself on the ground. His heart touched the ground, and his whole body touched the ground. He completed the worship. When the Tibetans saw that he had started the pilgrimage, they followed him one after another. They knelt down every 3 steps as they walked toward the Kathoda Temple halfway up the mountain. 2 foreigners who were climbing the mountain witnessed this scene. After listening to the translation of the female guide from China, they couldn't help but praise, what a magical country. What a magical pilgrim, what a magical living Buddha. The female guide, Wuxia, said with a dubious look, that scruffy man is a living Buddha? I don't believe it. One of the foreigners said, it doesn't matter whether he's a living Buddha or not. What's important is that he pressed his hand on the dead old man's head and the old man came back to life. It's really amazing. Wuxia, are all Chinese people so magical? Wuxia curled her lips and muttered in Chinese, who knows if he's just a blind cat running into a dead mouse. When the foreigner saw that she was speaking Chinese and he couldn't understand it, he shrugged helplessly and said to his companion, Hey, Jack, is your camera used as an ornament? Why didn't you take a picture of it just now? Jack said, Lubby, I didn't think of it. Don't worry, I'll take it out now. I won't turn it off again. Lubby smiled and said, then let's go all the way. I have a feeling that these people are going to cause trouble. Li Yunyang had no idea that a group of people was chasing him, but they were all in different ways. He had been crawling along the mountain path of Mount Duonyen. He had already gotten used to the weight of the fan of 7 treasures, which weighed more than 50 kilograms on his back. It was as light as a feather. Although he didn't run, even walking gave people the feeling that there was wind under his feet. The scenery on the side of the road kept passing behind him. When he was halfway up the mountain, Li Yunyang looked up and saw a magnificent temple standing in front of him. Under the golden sun, red palaces were densely packed like a forest. In this forest, the Naomi Sushiong Spirit Pagoda, known as the decoration of the Snow Mountain, was clustered in the middle of the palaces. Countless small white pagodas around it extended to the hillside, as if to guide the pilgrims on the way up. Before entering the temple, Li Yunyang felt a strong sense of majesty and pressure. This was a powerful force formed by the firm faith and will of countless pilgrims over thousands of years. It was like countless gods, tightly surrounding the temple and guarding the snow mountain. What a powerful force! Li Yunyang was secretly shocked. Stimulated by this force, the Jinshi in his body suddenly surged and gathered together. It was like two fierce beasts in the mountain forest had suddenly encountered each other, and each of them had raised their manes. As soon as the Jinshi in Li Yunyang's body gathered, he immediately felt that the power lingering over the temple suddenly formed a Vajra Arhat with a Vajra pestle in its hand and a red sun Vajra will behind it. With a ferocious expression, it pounced on him fiercely. Li Yunyang was shocked and was about to resist when he suddenly heard an old voice in his mind. Don't be hostile. If you are strong, it will be stronger. If you are weak, it will be weaker. This sudden voice stunned Li Yundong, and he subconsciously withdrew his aura. The breath in Li Yunyang's body came and went quickly. The Vajra Arhat that pounced on him also twisted in an instant and disappeared by the time it was in front of him. Li Yunyang was shocked by this sudden attack. When he came back to his senses, he turned his head and looked around, trying to see who had warned him. However, when he looked left and right, he saw an endless stream of tourists and pilgrims. He didn't see the Vajra Arhat he had seen before, nor did he see anyone suspicious. Li Yunyang was puzzled. After thinking about it for a while, he felt that this person shouldn't be malicious, so he put this matter aside and walked into the temple by himself. When Li Yunyang was no longer vigilant and wary, he could no longer feel the strong hostility hidden in the temple. After walking into the temple, Li Yunyang looked around and found that not only were there vendors selling incense, but there were also merchants selling food and drinks. In some places, there was even a tap. He nodded to himself and thought to himself, I've been on the road for so long. I'll rest here for a night before continuing my journey. After making up his mind, Li Yunyang found a platform and sat down. Changbajila, Meiduo, and the others, who were following behind him, bowed every 3 steps along the way. Their speed was astonishingly slow. It was not until it was almost dark that they slowly walked to the Kathuo temple. Although it was night, the temple was still full of incense, and white smoke curled up. Changbajila and the head lama of the temple had been friends for a long time. After the two of them warmly exchanged greetings, Changbajila led his people to the temple to rest. After a day of worship, the group was already exhausted. Some of them even found a place to lie down and sleep. Only Changbajila sat alone on the steps outside the temple, looking at the golden plaque of the Kathuo temple uneasily. Because of what had happened during the day, Meiduo sat on the steps with Changbajila obediently. She hugged her knees with both hands and looked at the white moon in the sky with a pair of dark eyes. Meiduo, are you still blaming me for teaching you a lesson in front of so many people today? Changbajila suddenly said. Meiduo shook her head, and the little braids on her head swayed. The ornaments hanging on the braids also swayed. No, Changbajila, you're right. I shouldn't have looked at people like that. My cultivation is not enough. Changbajila looked at Meiduo lovingly. Just as he was about to speak, a figure suddenly flashed from a corner not far away. Meiduo also saw this scene and suddenly shivered. She stood up and shook Changbajila's arm excitedly. Changbajila, it's him, it's him. Changbajila was stunned. What do you mean? Meiduo said excitedly, it's the Han brother who saved you, /om/. Chapter 174. Go to watch net. When Changbajila heard this, he immediately stood up and asked, where is he? Meiduo pulled Changbajila and chased after him. I saw him pass by just now. Go to watch net. 7 KOM. The two of them chased after him in a low voice. After only a few turns, they heard the sound of water. They poked their heads out and looked under the moonlight. Meiduo's face immediately turned red. She saw Li Yundong taking off his clothes and scrubbing his body under the tap. Although it was night, the moonlight was bright. Meiduo could clearly see Li Yundong's naked body, and she could also clearly see his muscles, which were like steel bars. After a month of hard work, almost all the fat on Li Yundong's body had been burned off, leaving only developed and strong muscles. The blood vessels under his skin had become extremely thick, and when he moved slightly, the muscles on his body would roll. Under the curtain of night, Li Yundong's back was facing Meiduo. His back was broad, and water droplets rolled down his back, reflecting the cold moonlight. This made his skin look like it was made of steel. It was hard and powerful, giving people a strong sense of security and strength. Although Changbajila was an experienced and knowledgeable old man, he suddenly saw Li Yundong standing there like an iron tower. Half of his body was hidden in the darkness, and the other half was bathed in the moonlight, mysterious and majestic. He couldn't help but wonder in his heart, he looks like a young man. How can he be so powerful? Is he not the living Buddha, but the Mahagala? The Mahagala was the guardian Vajra of Tibetan Buddhism. It had 3 heads and 6 arms, and was mighty and invincible. For a moment, the two of them were stunned. They held their breath and didn't make a sound. They just watched Li Yundong scrub his body under the tap and then put on his clothes. When Li Yundong put on his clothes, he suddenly became a very sloppy beggar. This strong contrast made Changbajila and Meiduo unable to react for a moment. This was the first time Li Yundong had taken a bath in nearly 10 days. After taking a bath, he felt refreshed and comfortable. He stood where he was, secretly mobilizing the qi in his body and feeling the condensed and vigorous true qi in his body rushing through his meridians. After a while, Li Yundong sat down cross-legged and began to meditate and practice qi. Watch net. Meiduo, who was standing to one side, was stunned. She pulled Changbajila's hand and was about to speak when Changbajila pulled her aside. After a long distance, he whispered, "I told you that he was a living Buddha. Do you believe me now?" The Taoist meditation posture was very similar to the Buddhist meditation posture, especially when looked at from the back. Meiduo was also surprised and whispered, "I didn't expect him to be a believer, but why doesn't he go on a pilgrimage?" Changbajila smiled and said, "We believe in Tibetan Buddhism." Perhaps he believes in Central Plains Buddhism. This is different. Meiduo asked, "Is he a follower of Buddhism in the Central Plains?" Changbajila thought about it and said, "It's possible." Meiduo asked, "Then what is he doing here? Look at him, he seems to have walked here. The calluses on his feet are very thick." Changbajila smiled and said, "Meiduo, you are very observant." Thinking of Li Yundong's strong body, which many Tibetan boys didn't have, Meiduo couldn't help but blush a little. She averted her eyes and changed the topic. "Changbajila, what do you think he is doing here?" Changbajila said, "Many Buddhists in the Central Plains, like us, also advocate asceticism, so there is a saying about ascetic monks. I guess this person is an ascetic monk." But speaking of this, Meiduo said, "But he didn't shave his hair." Changbajila couldn't help frowning and said, "Maybe he cultivates with his hair? But I've never heard of an ascetic monk cultivating with his hair." As they were talking, the two of them suddenly heard a low sound of something breaking through the air. The girl and the old man looked at each other and slowed down to see what was going on. Seeing this, the two of them were immediately stunned. They saw a thin line of white mist emerging from the top of Li Yundong's head. Although it was night, it could still be seen with the naked eye. His chest rose and fell, and when he took a deep breath, Meiduo and Changbajila felt as if the air around them had been sucked away by this young man. Meiduo had sharp eyes. She nudged Changbajila with her elbow and then pointed to the ground. Changbajila looked down and was so shocked that his eyeballs almost fell out of their sockets. Go to the internet. 7 KOM. When Li Yundong took a deep breath, the sand and dust on the ground rolled toward him, as if he was a huge black hole. But when Li Yundong exhaled, a straight and thin white line sprayed out of his mouth. It flew more than 10 meters away, hit the red and black walls of the temple, and then scattered in all directions. The two of them were shocked by Li Yundong's abnormality. Suddenly, the qi in Li Yundong's body began to surge violently, as if there was a thunderstorm in the sky. Countless thunderbolts fell and began to fiercely attack Li Yundong's lower abdomen and lower dantian. Li Yundong knew that this was a situation where he had to enter the Zhuji phase in advance, but his current environment was not right, so he didn't dare to enter the Zhuji phase directly. He suddenly opened his eyes and instantly mobilized the surging qi in his body into his arms. Then, he jumped up, exhaled, and punched a hard rock 3 meters away. With a muffled bang, Meiduo and Changbajila felt the ground under their feet tremble slightly, as if an invisible giant had just stamped on the ground. The two of them didn't dare to breathe too loudly. They just watched as Li Yundong gradually withdrew his qi and then carried the tightly tied fan of 7 treasures on his back again. Then, they left the temple and continued to climb to the top of the mountain. Meiduo and Changbajila waited until Li Yundong was far away before they dared to come out. At the same time, they moved closer to the rock that Li Yundong had punched 3 meters away, which was as tall as a man. This rock was originally a treasure of the Kathuo temple, which was engraved with golden Sanskrit characters. Li Yundong had exhaled in the dark, so he didn't have time to identify it. He punched out and made a fist mark in the middle of the treasure of the temple. Meiduo and Changbajila took a closer look and saw that there was a clear fist mark on the stone. With the bright moonlight, they could even see the clear and recognizable skin lines in the fist mark. Around the fist mark, the stone wall was extremely smooth, as if someone had deliberately skimmed it with a file. Meiduo and Changbajila looked at each other. Both of them were so shocked that they couldn't control themselves. Meiduo said, "God of heaven. This Han brother is too powerful." Changbajila also murmured excitedly, "Mahagala, this must be the reincarnation of Mahagala." While one of them was shocked and the other was excited, a cold cough suddenly came from behind them. Meiduo was startled and quickly turned around, only to see a boy standing in front of her. Although his hair had been washed, it was still messy and draped over his shoulders. The beard on his face almost covered his appearance. It was Li Yundong, who had returned. Li Yundong looked at Meiduo and Changbajila warily and asked in a deep voice, "Why are you following me?" At this time, Changbajila turned around and knelt down excitedly. He threw himself on the ground, the backs of his hands touching the ground, and his palms facing the sky. He said piously, "Mahagala, thank you for saving my life." Li Yundong's vigilance dropped slightly. He bowed slightly and made a gesture of bending down to support him. "You're welcome. It was just a small effort." Changbajila got up from the ground, turned his head, and glared at Meiduo, who was looking at Li Yundong curiously. He said in a low voice, "Why are you in a daze?" In Meiduo's eyes, the boy was not very tall, but his shoulders gave people a strong and burly feeling. Although his hair was messy and his face was covered with a beard, making him look like he was in his 40s or 50s, his eyes were as bright as the stars in the sky, and his voice didn't sound much older than hers. "Just how old is this Han brother?" "He doesn't seem to be much older than me, but why is he so powerful?" "Is it really as Changbajila said? Is he really the reincarnation of Mahagala?" Meiduo thought to herself. When she heard Changbajila's low scolding, she immediately came to her senses. Her ears were slightly red, and she said to Li Yundong in a slightly broken Chinese, "I'm really sorry for what happened today. You saved Changbajila's life, but I offended you. If you want to scold me or beat me, I will have no complaints." Meiduo was originally a beautiful woman, and she had the reputation of being the most beautiful flower in the tribe. Even her name, Meiduo, meant beautiful flower in Tibetan. Looking at a beauty under the moonlight made her even more charming and charming. Even an Iron Man would be a little soft-hearted when Meiduo apologized carefully, let alone Li Yundong, who was born to have tender feelings for the fairer sex. Li Yundong saw that although the Tibetan girl was dressed in a foreign style, her pure and innocent eyes were very similar to Su Chan's. He loved her, and he also had a good impression of Mei Duo. Otherwise, he wouldn't have helped her on the road at all. Li Yundong nodded to Mei Duo with a gentle smile on his face. You don't have to be so polite. When Mei Duo saw Li Yundong smile slightly, the way he looked at her also became particularly gentle. Although she was young, she had long understood the relationship between men and women. In addition, Tibetan girls were bold, enthusiastic, open, and lively. She subconsciously took this kind of look as Li Yundong's way of expressing his love for her. Her heart thumped wildly, and her ears turned red. As an old man in his 70s and 80s, Chambajila's heart was as clear as a mirror. He chuckled with a kind smile on his face and said in Chinese, "May I know the name of my benefactor?" Li Yundong smiled and said, "I don't deserve to be called a benefactor. Grandpa, you can just call me Li Yundong." Chambajila smiled and stroked the 3-inch-long white beard on his chest, saying, "It turns out to be brotherly. I wonder what you are doing here. Are you traveling or cultivating?" Li Yundong was stunned. He had thought that Chambajila had already recognized his identity as a cultivator when he had seen him practicing qi before. He thought for a moment and simply admitted, "I'm here to cultivate." Chambajila's smile became more and more brilliant. "That's great. We are also going on a pilgrimage to the Snow Mountain. If you don't mind, let's go together. What do you think?" Thinking of the way these people kowtowed every 3 steps, Li Yundong couldn't help but smile bitterly and refuse in his heart. He said, "I may be in a hurry, and you?" Chambajila seemed to have seen through Li Yundong's thoughts. He waved his hand and said with a smile, "We don't kowtow every 3 steps along the way. Only when we reach the foot of the holy mountain do we start to worship and move forward. Otherwise, I'm afraid that we would have kowtowed to death before we even reached the halfway point." Seeing that the old man was speaking heartily, Li Yundong couldn't help but laugh. Seeing that he was a little moved, Chambajila said to Mei Duo, "Don't you think so?" Mei Duo had been a little shy under Li Yundong's gaze before and hadn't dared to look him in the eye. At this time, hearing Chambajila's words, she suddenly raised her head with some courage and enthusiasm. She looked at Li Yundong with a pair of extremely beautiful big eyes and giggled. She really had bright eyes and white teeth. "Chambajila, you're right. Han brother, if you don't mind, come with us. We can take care of each other on the way. Moreover, this plateau is very big, and there are many wolves on it. Of course, although you are not afraid of wolves, what if you get lost?" The more Li Yundong looked at Mei Duo, the more he felt that she was very similar to Su Chan. He couldn't help but feel moved in his heart. He nodded and said, "Okay/om/. You're tuning into the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories."